Sometimes the sounds that comfort you most are the ones you should trust least. I've camped alone for 15 years, and I know the sound of my own zipper. Campground 27 sits off Forest Road 618, about 40 miles southeast of Flagstaff. It's one of those dispersed sites where you pick your own spot among the junipers and sage. No facilities, no other campers most weekends. Just you, your gear, and whatever lives out there in the high desert. I pulled in Friday evening with my usual setup. 2-person dome tent, white gas stove, cooler full of ice. The weather looked perfect. Clear skies, light wind from the southwest. I found my preferred spot near the eastern edge, where a cluster of junipers would block the worst of the morning sun. Setup went smooth. Tent stakes bit into the sandy soil without much trouble. I tied off the guy lines to some scattered volcanic rocks, double-checked the rainfly even though no clouds showed on the horizon. Old habits. By the time I had camp squared away, the sun was dropping behind the mesa to the west. First night passed quiet. I made dinner on the stove, just ramen and some leftover chicken, then sat outside reading until the headlamp battery started to dim. Wind picked up around 10, nothing dramatic. The tent walls fluttered gently, rain fly rustling against the poles. Normal sounds, comfortable sounds. I slept well. Saturday I hiked up to the old fire tower, spent most of the day exploring the mesa rim. By evening I was tired in that good way you get from walking all day in clean air. Made a simple dinner, crawled into the tent by 9:30. The wind had died to almost nothing. That's when I first heard it. A zipper. Slow, deliberate. The familiar metal-on-metal whisper of teeth separating. I assumed it was mine. Sometimes the tent zipper works loose if you don't pull it all the way to the corner. I reached over to check the door. Sealed tight. I lay still, listening. The zipper sound came again. Same rhythm, same speed as when I opened my tent door in the morning. But I was inside, and my zipper hadn't moved. Could be another camper, I thought, though I hadn't seen any other vehicles when I drove the loop that afternoon. Sound carries strange in the desert. Maybe someone had pulled in after dark, set up beyond the junipers where I couldn't see their headlights. The sound stopped. I waited maybe 10 minutes, then decided to test something. I unzipped my tent door about 6 inches. Slow and steady, the way I always do to keep the noise down. Another zipper answered. Same speed, same length. Perfect echo. I froze with my hand on the pull tab. The night was still. No wind, no insects, just that vast desert silence that makes you aware of your own breathing. I waited another few minutes, then zipped the door shut. The other zipper closed too. Exact timing. Here's what I should have done. Grabbed my headlamp, stepped outside, called out to whoever was playing games. Here's what I actually did. Lay in my sleeping bag with my heart hammering, trying to convince myself I was hearing things. But I wasn't hearing things. I tested it 3 more times over the next hour. Open 6 inches. Another zipper open 6 inches. Close it. The other one closed. Open it all the way. Perfect mirror response. The sound seemed to come from maybe 30 feet away, in the direction of the mesa rim. Around midnight, the moon broke through some high clouds I hadn't noticed before. Silver light filtered through the rainfly, enough to make out shapes inside the tent. I could see my pack, my boots, the outline of the stove outside near the guy lines. I could also see that one of my guy lines had been retied. I'm particular about knots. Always use a trucker's hitch on the corners, bowline on the sides. But the southwestern guy line was tied with a clove hitch. Simple knot, perfectly functional, but not mine. Someone had been at my tent while I slept Friday night. The smart thing would have been to pack up right then. Drive back to town, find a motel, come back for the gear in daylight if I had to. But you know how it is when you're tired and it's past midnight and the rational part of your brain starts making deals with the scared part. I convinced myself to wait until morning. The zipper sounds continued on and off until about 3 a.m. Always in response to mine, never initiating. Whatever was out there seemed content to mirror, not lead. By the time the sky started greying in the east, the sounds had stopped entirely. I packed by dawn light, quiet and methodical. Rolled the sleeping bag tight, broke down the stove, stuffed everything into the truck bed without ceremony. The creosote smell was stronger than usual. That sharp, medicinal scent that comes after the brief desert storms, though no rain had fallen. As I loaded the last of my gear, I glanced back toward the mesa rim. There, in the sand, maybe 20 yards from where my tent had been, I could see the compressed outline of another tent. Same size as mine, same rectangular footprint. The impression was clear enough to make out where the stakes had been driven, where the occupant had stepped getting in and out. But there was no tent there now, just the outline in the dust, and a single guy line still tied to a rock with a clove hitch. I drove out slow, checking the mirror until the junipers blocked my view of the site. The drive home took almost 2 hours, winding through the national forest roads until I hit the interstate. Every few miles, I'd catch myself looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following at the same distance. But the road stayed empty behind me. Haven't been back to campground 27 since. Probably won't be. I still camp solo, but I stick to established campgrounds now. Places with other people around, even if they're just weekend RV folks who pack up and leave on Sunday. Some sounds are better left unanswered. Radio static shouldn't know your call sign when you're working alone. Channel 7 had been dead for 3 months, so when it crackled my name at 2 a.m., I knew something was wrong. Prairie Vista Solar sits on 800 acres of Colorado grassland, about 60 miles east of Denver. Rows of panels stretch to the horizon, each one tilted to catch the morning sun. During the day, the place hums with inverters and cooling fans. At night, it's mostly silent, except for the wind through the chain link and the distant rumble of highway traffic. I'd been working security there for 2 years. Overnight shift, Wednesday through Sunday. Simple job, drive the perimeter every 2 hours, check the substations, make sure nobody was stealing copper or vandalizing equipment. The pay was decent, and I liked the solitude. Company issued us handheld radios, Motorola XTS series. 8 channels, though we mostly used channel 3 for dispatch and channel 5 for unit to unit. Channel 7 had been damaged in a lightning strike back in May. Dead air, nothing but static if you accidentally keyed it up. That Wednesday started routine. I clocked in at 11 p.m, got the briefing from day shift. Nothing unusual. Maintenance had been working on Transformer 6, but they'd finished up around 4 and locked everything down. I was the only security on site until morning. First patrol went smooth, drove the access road clockwise, checked all the gates, tested the emergency lighting. The reflective tacks we used to mark equipment positions caught my headlight beam at regular intervals. Little points of light confirming everything was where it should be. Radio chatter was minimal, just dispatch doing check-ins with the other sites every hour. By 1:30 a.m. I was back at the trailer, catching up on paperwork. That's when Channel 7 came alive. Static first, then a voice. Male, clear pronunciation. Unit 47, Prairie Vista. My call sign. But nobody else was on duty. I keyed channel 3. Dispatch, this is Unit 47. You trying to reach me? Negative, 47. I've got you on channel 3. Everything good out there? Yeah, all clear. Just thought I heard my call sign on 7 inches. Channel 7's been down since the storm. You sure? I wasn't sure. Radio static can sound like voices when you're tired, and the night's been too quiet. I went back to the paperwork. 10 minutes later, Unit 47, Prairie Vista. Same voice, same cadence, but this time I was ready. I grabbed the handheld, checked the display. Channel 7, active transmission. Green light showing someone was keying up. I switched to 7 and listened. Nothing but carrier wave hiss. When the transmission ended, I tried responding. Unit 47 here. Who's this? Silence. Then, maybe 3 seconds later, Unit 47 here. Who's this? My own voice. Same words, same inflection, but with a slight delay like an old long-distance phone call. The transmission lasted exactly as long as mine had. I switched back to channel 3, called dispatch again. Can you check if maintenance left any equipment transmitting on channel 7? I'll make some calls. Sit tight. While I waited, I decided to test something. Switched back to 7, keyed the mic. Testing 1, 2, 3. 3-second pause. Then, testing 1, 2, 3. Perfect copy of my voice. Down to the way I emphasized the word testing. But that delay, just long enough to be unsettling. Dispatch came back 20 minutes later. Maintenance confirms all their equipment is shut down. No scheduled transmissions on any frequency tonight. Must be some kind of atmospheric skip. You know how these prairie storms can bounce signals. Made sense, sort of. Radio propagation gets weird during certain weather conditions. Signals can travel hundreds of miles, bounce off the ionosphere, create strange echoes. But this felt different. Too precise, too immediate. I left the radio on channel 7 for the rest of the shift, monitoring while I did my patrols. Every hour or so, the voice would come back. Always the same pattern. My call sign first. Then it would mirror anything I said in response. Never initiated new conversation, just reflected. Around 4 a.m. I was checking the substation near the north fence line when I noticed something off about the radio repeater tower. The maintenance guys had a backup transmitter mounted about halfway up, part of the emergency communication system. It was pointed roughly southeast toward the main building, but I remembered it being oriented northeast the week before, aimed at the highway repeater. Small detail, easy to miss unless you paid attention to that kind of thing. But the mounting bracket had definitely been repositioned. Maybe 2 degrees of rotation, enough to change the coverage pattern. The reflective tacks we used to mark equipment at night had been moved too, repositioned to correspond with the new antenna orientation. I walked the base of the tower with my flashlight, checking for signs of recent work. The ground around the guy wires looked disturbed, like someone had been digging. Fresh tire tracks in the gravel, but they could have been from the maintenance crew's last visit. What bothered me was the smell. Sharp ozone, like the air right before a thunderstorm. But there wasn't a cloud in the sky, and the weather forecast had been clear all week. I made a note in the log, finished the patrol. By sunrise, the voice transmissions had stopped entirely. Channel 7 went back to dead static, like always. Day shift came in at 7. A guy named Roberts, who'd been there longer than anyone. I mentioned the radio issue, described what I'd heard. He listened, nodded slowly. Happened to Martinez last month, he said. Different channel, but same thing. Voice that sounded like his, repeating everything back with a delay. Maintenance checked all the equipment, couldn't find anything wrong. What did Martinez think it was? Robert shrugged. Atmospheric conditions. These big installations can act like antennas sometimes, pick up weird signals. Truckers, aircraft, sometimes even cordless phones from miles away. What about the repeater tower? You notice if it got moved? Can't say I have. But maintenance was up there Monday doing routine work. Probably just repositioned it for better coverage. I clocked out, drove home, tried to sleep, but I kept thinking about that 3-second delay. If it was atmospheric skip or equipment malfunction, why was the timing so consistent? And why did it only mirror my voice, never dispatch or any other radio traffic? The ozone smell from that morning stuck with me too. Sharp and clean, but wrong for the season and weather conditions. 3 weeks later, I put in for a transfer to day shift. Told them I wanted more regular hours, which was true enough. But really, I didn't want to work alone with the radios anymore. Channel 7 is still dead air, far as I know. Sometimes I wonder if it's really dead, or just waiting for the right voice to copy. Roberts retired last month. His replacement mentioned something interesting during the handoff. Apparently, the radio logs show periodic transmissions on Channel 7, but only during night shifts. Always the same duration, always the same power signature. Company's been trying to track down the source for months. They haven't found it yet. The footsteps always stopped directly above my bed, like someone checking if I was still there. For 3 weeks, something walked across my roof at exactly 3:17 a.m. I'd moved into the rental bungalow in October, a one-bedroom place about 10 miles outside Olympia. The landlord called it rustic charm. Cedar shake roof, Douglas fir beams, single-pane windows that rattled when the wind picked up. It sat on 2 acres of second-growth forest, private enough that you couldn't see the neighbors' lights through the trees. Perfect for someone who worked from home and valued quiet. The first week went smoothly. I set up my office in the spare room, arranged furniture, got familiar with the quirks. Old house sounds, floorboards creaking when the temperature changed, pipes knocking when the heater kicked on. Nothing unusual. The footsteps started on a Tuesday. I'd gone to bed around midnight, was drifting off when I heard them. Slow, deliberate steps across the roof. Boot heels on cedar shakes, moving from what sounded like the chimney area toward the back of the house, toward my bedroom. My first thought was raccoons. Big ones, maybe a family group. But the rhythm was wrong. Too steady, too purposeful. These were bipedal steps, spaced like a person walking carefully across uneven footing. The steps stopped directly above my bed. I could hear them clearly through the thin ceiling insulation. 1, 2, 3, 4 steps, then silence. Whatever was up there stood still for maybe 30 seconds, then walked back toward the chimney. I grabbed a flashlight, went outside to check. The motion sensor light by the front door illuminated most of the yard, but the roof was too high and steep to see much detail. No ladder, no obvious way someone could have climbed up. The nearest tree was a good 15 feet from the house. I called the landlord the next morning, mentioned I might have heard someone on the roof. He said he'd had problems with transients in the area, suggested I call the sheriff if it happened again. It happened again at 3:17 a.m. Exactly, same pattern. Steps from chimney to bedroom, pause directly overhead. return to chimney. I timed it with my phone. The entire sequence took 2 minutes and 40 seconds, give or take 5 seconds. By the end of the first week, I was setting my alarm for 3:15. The footsteps came every night, precise as clockwork. I started mapping the path in my head, counting steps. 14 from chimney to bedroom position, 30-second pause, 14 steps back. On Thursday, I tried something different. When the steps reached their usual stopping point above my bed, I got up and walked to the kitchen. The steps followed. Not immediately. There was a delay, like whoever was up there was listening, then adjusting their position to stay above me. When I stopped, they stopped. When I moved back to the bedroom, they moved back too. That's when I started thinking it might not be human. Friday morning, I found my security camera had been moved. I'd mounted it on the back porch to watch the sliding door, angled to cover most of the yard, but someone had repositioned it to point at the bedroom window instead. Subtle adjustment, maybe 2 degrees of rotation, but enough to change what it was recording. The camera's memory card was missing. I drove into town, bought a new camera, and a motion-activated trail cam. Set them up Saturday evening, one covering the backyard, one aimed at the roofline. If something was getting up there, I wanted to know how. Saturday night, 3:17 a.m. The steps came as usual, but this time they were different. Instead of the normal steady pace, they matched my movements exactly. When I walked to the bathroom, the roof footsteps followed the same rhythm. When I stopped, they stopped. When I deliberately changed my pace, slow, then quick, then slow again, the roof walker mirrored perfectly. It was copying my gait. Sunday morning, I checked both cameras. The yard camera showed nothing unusual. The roof camera had been repositioned again, now pointing down at the ground instead of up at the roofline. The adjustment was precise. Someone had loosened the mounting bracket, rotated it exactly 90 degrees, then retightened it. The motion sensor data showed activity at 3:42 a.m., about 25 minutes after the usual roof walking time. That evening, I moved my kitchen chair to face the bedroom window instead of the table. Small change, but I wanted to see if whatever was watching me would notice. Monday morning, the chair was facing the window, but it had been moved 18 inches to the left, positioned directly in line with the bed. From that angle, someone sitting in the chair would have a perfect view of where I slept. I'd had enough. Monday night, I stayed awake, sitting in the dark with a flashlight and my phone ready to call 911. At 3:15, I heard the first steps on the roof. Same pattern, same rhythm, but this time, when they stopped above the bedroom, I walked to the window and looked up. The steps had stopped directly above me, but there was nothing visible on the roof line, just empty shakes and the dark outline of the chimney against the sky. I turned on the flashlight, swept the beam across the visible section of roof. That's when I heard my own footsteps walking back across the roof above me. Not similar footsteps, mine. The exact sound of my boots on hardwood floor, reproduced perfectly in the rhythm of steps across cedar shakes. The sound moved from above the bedroom back toward the chimney, matching the pace I just used walking to the window. I stood there with the flashlight beam wavering, listening to something walk away across my roof, using the sound of my own footsteps. The scent hit me then. Wet rock and iron, like old nails left in the rain. Sharp and metallic, coming through the window screen despite the autumn chill. I lit the white gas camp stove I kept for power outages, watched the blue flame flare to life. The steady hiss was comforting somehow, a normal sound in a night that had gone completely wrong. Tuesday morning, I gave notice to the landlord. Told him I'd found a place closer to town, needed to move quickly for work reasons. He was understanding, didn't ask too many questions. I packed that afternoon, loaded everything into a rented truck. As I was doing the final walkthrough, I found one more thing. In the bedroom closet, pushed all the way to the back, was a small pile of cedar shake fragments. Fresh chips, like someone had been scraping them off the roof with their fingernails. The pile was arranged in a rough outline, the shape of a person lying down. I locked the house, left the keys in the mailbox, and drove away. Never went back, even to get my security deposit. Sometimes at night, in my new place, I catch myself listening for footsteps on the roof, but it's been quiet, so far. When your footsteps echo back from the canyon, you expect them to fade, not follow you to camp. The echo from my footsteps lasted 3 seconds too long. I'd driven down to the San Rafael swell for a long weekend, found a pullout about half a mile from the main overlook. Good spot, flat enough for the tent, close enough to the rim for sunrise views, far enough from the tourist crowds for some peace. October weather was perfect for southern Utah camping. Clear skies and temperatures dropping into the 40s after dark. Set up camp took maybe an hour. Simple layout. Tent pitched 20 feet back from the drop-off. Kitchen area near a cluster of juniper trees for wind protection. The canyon stretched out below, red rock walls stepping down maybe 800 feet to the wash bottom. Beautiful country, the kind that makes you understand why people spend their whole lives exploring the desert. Around 5 p.m., I decided to walk the rim before dinner. There's an informal trail that follows the canyon edge for about 2 miles east, marked with occasional cairns where the route crosses slick rock sections. Easy hiking, mostly flat, with some minor ups and downs where side canyons cut into the main formation. The trail was empty. I walked steady for about 40 minutes, stopping to check out a few alcoves and natural arches. Sound carried strange down there. My footsteps would echo off the opposite wall with a clean delay, maybe 2.5 seconds each way. Normal canyon acoustics. I turned around at a narrow spot where the trail got sketchy, started back toward camp. That's when I first noticed the extra echo. Most of the return hike sounded normal. My boots on sandstone 2-second delay echo from across the canyon. But every few minutes, I'd hear an additional footstep. Not quite an echo. The timing was wrong. More like someone walking parallel to me, matching my pace but slightly behind. I stopped to listen. The normal echo stopped with me, but I could swear I heard one more step, coming from somewhere closer than the far canyon wall. Started walking again. Within a few minutes, there it was. My step, echo from across the canyon. Then a third step that seemed to come from maybe 30 or 40 feet to my right. Same rhythm, same weight, but delayed just enough to stand out. I tested it, took 3 deliberate steps, then stopped. Echo came back normal. Step, 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 clean and precise. Then a 4th step, quieter but distinct, coming from the direction of a shallow draw that paralleled the main canyon. The smart thing would have been to head straight back to camp. But you know how it is when something doesn't make sense. You want to understand it before you decide whether to be worried. I worked my way over toward the sound, moving carefully across the slick rock. The draw was maybe 20 feet deep, carved by flash floods over the centuries. Plenty of places for someone to walk without being seen from the rim trail. But there was nobody down there. I spent 10 minutes checking both directions, looking for tracks in the sand patches between the rock outcrops. Found plenty of animal sign, deer, maybe a fox, but no boot prints. By then the sun was getting low, painting the canyon walls that deep red you only see in late afternoon. I headed back to camp, moving faster than I probably should have on the uneven ground. The extra footsteps continued all the way back, always from the right side, always matching my pace, always with that slight delay that made it sound like someone following just out of sight. Back at camp, I fired up the white gas stove and started dinner. Simple meal, pasta and sauce from a pouch. While the water boiled, I checked my GPS to mark the hiking route. I like to keep track of where I've been, especially in country where the landmarks all start to look similar. That's when I found the problem with my track log. According to the GPS, I'd hiked a perfect loop. The device showed me leaving camp, walking east along the rim, then somehow circling back to approach camp from the southwest. But that was impossible. There's no trail connection that direction, and I definitely hadn't hiked a loop. I scrolled through the breadcrumb trail on the screen. The eastbound track looked normal, following the rim trail exactly, but the return track showed me cutting inland, following a route that would have taken me across country through some pretty rough terrain. Terrain I definitely hadn't hiked. I double-checked the timestamps. According to the GPS, I'd completed the loop version in exactly the same time it had taken me to hike out and back on the rim trail. The timestamps were consistent, but the route was completely wrong. Equipment malfunction, probably. GPS units can get confused in canyon country, especially when they lose satellite coverage near cliff faces. Still, I'd never seen a track log that far off from reality. I ate dinner, watching the last light fade from the canyon walls. No more footstep sounds, just the usual evening quiet. Wind through the junipers, distant coyote calls, the soft hiss of the stove cooling down. Slept well, woke up with the sunrise painting the eastern rim. While I packed up camp, I decided to check for tracks around the area where I'd heard the extra footsteps. Found them about 30 yards from my tent. Clear boot prints in a patch of sand between two junipers. Size looked about right for mine, similar tread pattern, but they followed a line that made no sense, coming from the direction of the side draw, approaching to within maybe 20 feet of my tent, then heading back the way they came. I followed the tracks as far as I could. They led toward the edge of the rim, following roughly the same route my GPS had mistakenly recorded. At the cliff edge, they just stopped. No signs of anyone climbing down, no loose rock or disturbed vegetation. The track simply ended at a spot where the drop-off was clean and sheer. I checked my own boots against the prints. Similar size, similar pattern, but not exactly the same. Close enough to be the same brand and model, but there were differences in the wear patterns. Whoever had made those tracks walked with a slightly different gait than mine. The sour smell of juniper sap was stronger than usual that morning, sharp and resinous, like someone had been breaking branches in the area, but I couldn't see any damaged trees. The scent seemed to linger around the boot prints, concentrated in that one patch of sand. Packed up and drove out around 9 a.m. As I pulled away from the pullout, I caught a flash of distant lightning from a storm system moving in from the west. No thunder yet, but the clouds were building against the horizon like a promise of weather change. Took me about 3 hours to drive home. When I unpacked the truck, I found something odd in my day pack. A small piece of red sandstone, maybe 2 inches across, with what looked like a partial boot print pressed into the surface. I'd never seen it before. The rock wasn't from anywhere I'd hiked, different color and texture than the rim trail geology. But there it was, tucked into the main compartment like a souvenir I'd forgotten about. The partial print was too clear, too precise, like someone had deliberately pressed their boot into soft stone and left it for me to find. When I tried speaking to myself, testing my voice against the canyon silence of memory, there was something wrong with the timing. A slight delay, like the words were catching up to themselves. I kept the rock for a few weeks, sitting on my desk as a reminder of the trip, but something about it bothered me. Eventually I threw it away. Some souvenirs aren't worth keeping. Elevators don't run maintenance cycles at 3 a.m., especially when the building's been empty for hours. The elevator kept stopping at floors that didn't exist. Meridian Plaza is a 12-story office building in downtown Dallas, built in the 80s when glass and steel was the only way anyone knew how to build. I worked building maintenance there, night shift, Monday through Friday. Decent job. Check the HVAC systems, replace burned out bulbs, handle any tenant emergencies that couldn't wait until morning. Most nights I had the building to myself. Security was contracted out to an outside company, but they just did perimeter checks from their car. Inside, it was just me and whatever problems needed fixing. The elevators were older Otis models, hydraulic systems that required regular inspection. Part of my routine was riding each car up and down once per shift, checking for unusual sounds or rough operation. Building had 2 passenger elevators and 1 freight lift. All of them ran smooth most of the time. Tuesday night, I was doing the elevator check around 11:30 p.m. Started with car A, rode it from the lobby to the 12th floor and back down. Normal operation, smooth acceleration, level stops, doors opening and closing on schedule. Car B felt different. It rose normally to the 2nd floor, stopped, doors open to an empty hallway. Standard. But when I pressed the button for floor 3, the car continued up past 3, past 4, and stopped with a soft chime. The floor indicator showed 13. Meridian Plaza doesn't have a 13th floor. Like a lot of buildings from that era, they skipped it in the numbering. Floors went 1 through 12, with 12 being the top. I'd been working there 8 months, knew the layout by heart, but the elevator thought it was on 13. I pressed the door open button. The doors slid apart to reveal a concrete wall. Raw concrete, no finish work, like the floor had been started but never completed. The smell was strong. Hot plastic mixed with old drywall compound, like electrical equipment overheating. I pressed 12. The car dropped 1 floor. Doors opened normally to the familiar 12th floor hallway. Everything looked right. Carpet, fluorescent lights, tenant office doors with their brass nameplates. I rode the elevator down to the lobby, made a note in my logbook. Probably a control panel malfunction. These old systems got glitchy sometimes, especially when the building's temperature control systems cycled on and off. But car B kept doing it. Every night for the next week, same thing. I'd press a button for any floor above 6, and the car would stop at 13 first. Always showed floor 13 on the indicator. Always open to that same concrete wall. Always had that hot plastic smell, like something burning behind the walls. I called the elevator service company, explained the problem. They said they'd send a tech out during regular business hours to check the control circuits. Thursday night, I brought my phone, took some pictures of the floor indicator showing 13. Figured I'd need documentation if this turned into a bigger repair issue. But when I looked at the photos later, they showed the normal floor numbers, 1 through 12, nothing unusual. The camera seemed to have captured something else though. In the reflection on the polished elevator doors, I could see what looked like a second set of floor buttons. Mirror image of the normal panel, but the numbers were different. Instead of skipping 13, this reflected panel showed floors 1 through 13, with 13 at the top where 12 should be. Friday night, I decided to test something. Instead of riding car B myself, I sent it up empty and watched from the lobby. Called it from the 12th floor using the emergency phone, then monitored which floors it stopped at. The car rose normally to 6, then 7, then 8, but between 11 and 12, it stopped for almost 30 seconds. The floor indicator in the lobby showed 13 during that pause. When it finally continued to 12, the indicator returned to normal. I took the stairs to 12, met the elevator when it arrived. Empty car, nothing unusual inside, but the control panel showed recent activity. 3 button presses that didn't correspond to anything I'd selected from the lobby. The service tech came out the following Monday. I showed him my log entries, described the phantom 13th floor stops. He checked the control circuits, tested all the floor sensors, ran diagnostic programs on the main computer. Everything came back normal. These old buildings, he said, packing up his tools. Sometimes the electrical systems create interference. You get phantom signals, false readings. Nothing to worry about as long as the car operates safely. But I knew it wasn't electrical interference. Monday night, I decided to ride car B all the way to whatever floor 13 actually was. When the elevator stopped and the doors opened to the concrete wall, I stepped forward and pressed my hand against the surface. It was warm, not just warm, hot, like there was something generating heat on the other side. And I could hear something. Faint machinery sounds, like HVAC equipment running. But the building's mechanical systems were all on the roof and in the basement. I pulled out my phone, tried to take another picture. The camera made 3 clicking sounds in rapid sequence, left, right, behind me, like multiple cameras firing at once. But I was alone in the elevator. The concrete wall wasn't really concrete, I realized. It was painted drywall, designed to look like unfinished construction. And there was a hairline crack running vertically down the middle, like a door seam. I pressed against the crack. The wall gave slightly, like it was hinged. That's when the elevator door started to close. I stepped back quickly, pressed the button for the lobby. The car dropped normally, but I could swear I heard footsteps in the shaft above me as we descended. Long strides, like someone with unusually large feet walking across the roof of the elevator car. Tuesday morning, I found out something interesting. The building's original construction plans, filed with the city in 1984, showed 13 floors. Floor 13 was designed as mechanical space, HVAC equipment, electrical panels, building management systems. But the final inspection records from 1985 only certified 12 floors. According to the city, floor 13 was never completed. So where was I going when the elevator stopped at 13? I put in for a transfer to day shift the following week. Told my supervisor I wanted more regular hours, which was true enough. But really, I didn't want to be alone in that building anymore. The day shift maintenance guy mentioned something when I handed over my keys. Car B's been acting up, he said. Stops at floors nobody selected. During business hours, it just opens and closes the doors, like it's picking up passengers that aren't there. I didn't tell him about floor 13. Some problems are better left for the next shift. When the headlight wash from security sweeps caught the building windows that final night, I could see shadows moving on a floor that officially didn't exist. Tall figures walking back and forth behind windows that showed only darkness from the street. I never found out what was really on floor 13, but sometimes I drive past Meridian Plaza at night, and the lights are on up there. Hardware doesn't develop expressions, but the latch on my bedroom window seemed to disagree. Metal doesn't smile, but the window latch in my bedroom had definitely changed shape. I'd bought the adobe house in March, 10 acres outside Española in the high desert north of Santa Fe. Single story, thick walls, traditional vigas supporting the flat roof. Previous owner was an artist who'd lived there for 30 years before moving to assisted living. The place had good bones, and that kind of settled quiet you only get in houses that have hosted decades of peaceful routine. First few weeks were spent getting familiar with the quirks. Adobe houses have their own personality. Walls that shift slightly with temperature changes, doors that stick in certain weather, windows that require just the right touch to open and close properly. The bedroom window faced east, toward the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Simple casement design with a brass latch that had developed a nice patina over the years. The latch was shaped like a crescent moon, decorative but functional. I'd open the window most mornings to let in the cool air, close it again when the afternoon sun started heating up the room. By May, I noticed the latch looked different. Nothing dramatic. The crescent shape had developed what looked like a small indent on one side, and the end had worn to a more rounded point. Normal weathering, probably. Brass fittings change over time, especially in the high desert where the temperature swings can be extreme. But the change seemed to have happened too quickly. I took a photo with my phone, compared it to a picture I'd snapped when I first moved in. The difference was subtle but clear. The latch had somehow been reshaped, bent slightly inward so the crescent formed more of a curve, almost like a smile. By June, the resemblance was unmistakable. The brass had worn in exactly the right places to create the impression of a face. 2 small dark spots where the mounting screws were positioned, like eyes. The crescent curve of the latch itself, now clearly resembling a mouth. And somehow, the patina had darkened in just the right areas to emphasize the features. I mentioned it to my neighbor Elena when she stopped by to drop off some chilies from her garden. She examined the latch, ran her finger along the brass curve. "Hardware does strange things out here," she said. "The temperature changes, the wind, the minerals in the soil. I've seen metal fittings twist themselves into shapes that make you think twice. You think it's normal?" "Define normal," she said, smiling. "This is old country. Things happen that don't happen other places." That wasn't particularly reassuring. By July, I started noticing other changes. The kitchen faucet handle had developed a slight bend that hadn't been there before. The front door knocker, a simple brass ring, had somehow gotten twisted so it hung at an odd angle. Small modifications, easy to miss unless you were paying attention. But they all seemed to be happening in areas where I spent the most time. I installed a trail camera in the bedroom, positioned to watch the window. If someone was coming onto the property at night, messing with the hardware, I wanted evidence. The camera was motion activated, infrared capable, the kind hunters use to monitor game trails. First week of footage showed nothing unusual, just me opening and closing the window each morning and evening. Occasional moths attracted to the motion sensor's IR beam. Second week was different. The camera captured something at 3:30 a.m. on a Tuesday. Motion trigger activated, but the image showed the bedroom empty, window closed. Nothing visible that should have set off the sensor. But in the corner of the frame, just barely visible. The window latch appeared to be moving, not being moved by an external force, moving on its own. The brass crescent was flexing slightly, like metal bending under pressure. The movement was subtle, maybe a few millimeters of deflection, but it was definitely happening. The timestamp showed the motion continuing for almost 3 minutes before stopping. I played the footage back several times, trying to figure out what I was seeing. Metal doesn't bend spontaneously. There had to be an explanation. Temperature change, vibration from something outside, maybe a flaw in the camera's infrared system. But the latch had definitely moved. Thursday night, I heard sounds from the bedroom around 3 a.m. Soft scraping, like metal on metal. I grabbed a flashlight and investigated. The window was closed, latch secure, but the brass surface felt warm to the touch, and there was a faint smell of mouse nest ammonia in the air. Sharp and acrid, like old urine. Friday morning, the latch looked different again. The smile was more pronounced, and the metal had developed what looked like dimples on either side. If you didn't know better, you'd swear the thing was expressing genuine happiness. I decided to test something. Before going to bed Friday night, I tied a piece of thin string around the latch, connecting it to the window frame. If something was physically manipulating the hardware, the string would show disturbance. Saturday morning, the string was gone. Not broken, not cut, gone. Disappeared completely. And the latch had been polished to a bright shine, like someone had spent time buffing it with metal polish. But it was still smiling. That evening, I moved a chair to face the bedroom window, sat in the dark with my phone ready to record. If something was happening to the latch, I wanted to see it directly. Around 2:30 a.m. the brass started to move. It flexed slowly, bending inward and back, like someone was pressing on it from the outside. But there was nothing visible on the other side of the glass. The motion was deliberate, rhythmic, almost playful. I turned on the flashlight, pointed it at the window. The movement stopped immediately, but in the beam of light, I could see condensation on the glass in the shape of a handprint. Large hand, fingers, blade, pressed against the outside of the window. The handprint faded as I watched, moisture evaporating in the dry desert air. I kept the light on the window for another hour. No more movement from the latch, no more handprints, but I could feel something watching from outside, patient and still. Sunday morning, I found additional evidence. In the soft dirt around the house, there were footprints, larger than mine, with an unusual gait pattern. The prints showed someone walking the perimeter of the house repeatedly, pausing at each window, then moving on. The prints stopped directly outside the bedroom window. There, pressed into the adobe brick near the sill, were the clear impressions of fingertips, as if someone had been feeling along the wall, examining the texture of the house itself. But here's what bothered me most. The fingertip impressions were too long. Human fingers don't extend that far past the first knuckle. When I checked the trail camera's EXIF data, I found something disturbing. Several images showed timestamps that were impossible. Photos taken before the camera had been installed, or during times when I could prove I'd been somewhere else entirely. But those phantom images showed my bedroom from angles the camera couldn't reach, and they included details that only someone who'd been inside the house would know. I packed that afternoon, loaded my truck with the essentials, left the furniture, told myself I'd come back for it later. But I knew I wouldn't. As I drove away, I glanced back at the house in my rearview mirror. The bedroom window was open, though I'd left it closed, and in the late afternoon sun, I could swear the brass latch was catching the light at just the right angle to look like it was winking. The new tenants moved in 6 months later. Elena mentioned they seemed happy with the place, said they loved the character of the old hardware. I didn't ask for details. When something in the woods starts using your voice to call for help, it's time to stop answering. The voice calling my name from the tree line sounded exactly like mine. I'd driven up to the Beartooth Wilderness for a 4-day solo backpacking trip, planning to hike the ridge trail from Cook City to the Alpine Lakes near Anderson Mesa. Late September weather was perfect for high country hiking. Cool nights, clear days, and most of the tourist crowds had cleared out after Labor Day. The trailhead was empty when I started out Thursday morning. 12 miles to my planned camp spot, gaining about 3,000 feet through dense lodgepole forest before breaking into the alpine zone. Good trail, well marked, nothing technical. I made camp around 4 p.m. on a flat spot just below tree line, about 50 yards from where the trail curved around a granite outcrop. Perfect setup, protected from wind, close to a reliable creek, with clear views down the valley I'd hiked up. Standard routine. Pitched the tent, hung my food bag, got the white gas stove set up for dinner. The reflective tacks I used to mark my camp boundaries caught the late afternoon sun, little points of light scattered among the sparse alpine firs. First night passed quiet. Made a simple dinner, read until the headlamp started dimming, crawled into the sleeping bag by 9, slept well despite the altitude. Friday, I day hiked up to the ridge, spent most of the morning exploring the lake basin, found some good fishing spots, took photos of the fall aspen colors in the draws below tree line. By afternoon, I was back at camp, tired but content. That's when I first heard it. Around 6 p.m., while I was heating water for dinner, a voice called from the forest below camp. Male voice, clear pronunciation. "Hey, up here," my voice. Exactly my voice. Down to the slight hoarseness I get at altitude. I turned off the stove, listened. The voice came again, closer this time. "Hello? Anyone up there?" I grabbed my headlamp and walked toward the sound. The forest was thick enough that I couldn't see more than 30 or 40 feet into the trees. "Hello?" I called back. Silence. Then, maybe 10 seconds later, "Hello? Anyone up there?" Perfect reproduction of my words, my inflection, even the slight hesitation before anyone. But the voice was coming from deeper in the forest, farther away than it should have been if someone was actually responding to me. I worked my way down through the trees, following the sound. The voice kept calling, always the same phrases, always in my voice. But every time I got close to where it seemed to be coming from, the sound would shift. Left, then right, then behind me. After 20 minutes of this, I gave up and headed back to camp. Probably just some kind of echo effect. Sound can do strange things in mountain country, especially when you're tired and the air pressure's changing. But when I got back to camp, my stove had been moved. Not far, maybe 2 feet from where I'd left it. But I'm careful about camp setup, especially with white gas equipment. I always position the stove in the same spot relative to my tent door, always oriented the same way. This stove was facing the wrong direction. I checked the rest of my gear. Everything else seemed normal, but the reflective tacks I'd used to mark camp boundaries had been repositioned. Instead of a rough circle around my tent, they now formed a straight line pointing down into the forest, toward where the voice had been calling from. I reset the tacks, fired up the stove again, made dinner, but I kept the headlamp handy and listened carefully to every sound from the forest below. Around 8 p.m., The voice started again. This time, it was using phrases I'd said earlier in the day. Perfect setup. Good trail. Made camp around 4 p.m. Words I'd spoken to myself while hiking, thinking out loud the way you do when you're alone in the backcountry. But I hadn't spoken those words anywhere near the forest. I'd said them up on the ridge, miles from camp. The voice continued for about an hour, cycling through my vocabulary like someone practicing pronunciation. Always my voice, always perfect reproduction. But the phrases were getting mixed up. Perfect trail. Good setup around 4 p.m. Made good camp. Like something was learning my speech patterns, but didn't quite understand the meaning. Around 9 p.m., I decided to test something. I called out toward the forest. Testing, 1, 2, 3. 10 seconds later, testing, 1, 2, 3. I tried a longer phrase. This is getting weird. Same delay. Perfect reproduction. This is getting weird. Then I tried something the voice hadn't heard before. My name is Marcus Reed. The delay was longer this time, maybe 15 seconds. Then, my name is Marcus Reed. But the emphasis was wrong. Instead of natural speech, it sounded like someone sounding out syllables. My name is Marcus Reed. I went to bed with the headlamp close by and my hiking poles within reach. Didn't sleep much. The voice kept calling until about 2 a.m., cycling through the same phrases over and over. Saturday morning, I found more evidence. My camp stove had been moved again, this time positioned to point directly at a gap in the trees. The gap led to a game trail that descended into the thick forest, and there were tracks in the soft earth around my tent. Large tracks, bigger than mine, with an unusual stride pattern. The prints showed someone circling my tent repeatedly during the night, always staying just outside the reflective tack boundary I'd established. But here's what bothered me. The tracks showed a peculiar gait. Long steps, but with a pause between each footfall, like someone learning to walk upright. I packed up and started hiking out. Didn't want to spend another night listening to my own voice call from the forest. But the voice followed me. For the first mile down the trail, I could hear it calling from the trees alongside the path. Always my voice, always the same phrases, but now with an edge of urgency. Hey, up here. Hello? Anyone up there? This is getting weird. Like something was trying to get my attention. Around noon, I stopped at a creek crossing to filter water and eat lunch. While the filter was running, I heard something that made my blood run cold. My voice, calling from the forest. Help! I'm lost. Words I'd never spoken. A plea I'd never made, but delivered in perfect reproduction of my voice, complete with the tone of genuine distress. I grabbed my gear and started moving again, hiking faster than was smart on the rocky trail. But the voice kept pace, calling from different positions in the forest, always just out of sight, always using my voice to call for help. Help! I'm hurt. Can't find the trail. Please, someone help me. Each phrase delivered with increasing desperation, but using my exact vocal patterns, like something had learned not just how I spoke, but how I might sound in different emotional states. By the time I reached the trailhead, the voice had stopped. I threw my pack in the truck, drove straight to the ranger station in Cook City. Told them I'd heard someone calling for help in the backcountry. Thought there might be a lost hiker. They organized a search party. Went in that afternoon with dogs and radios. Found nothing. No missing hikers, no signs of distress, no evidence of anyone needing help. But they did find something interesting near where my camp had been. the search team discovered a game trail that showed recent heavy use. Large tracks, unusual gait pattern, following the main hiking trail for several miles before branching off into roadless wilderness. The tracks were too big to be human, they said. Probably a large bear walking on its hind legs, maybe investigating campsites for food. I didn't correct them. 2 weeks later, I got a call from a ranger. Another backpacker had reported hearing voices in the same area, someone calling for help in the forest near Anderson Mesa. They'd organized another search, found nothing. But the hiker had been specific about one detail. The voice calling for help had sounded exactly like his own. Emergency stairwells echo, but they shouldn't echo back more knocks than you made. I knocked 3 times on the stairwell door, and 4 knocks came back. Desert Regional Medical Center sits on the outskirts of Las Vegas, a 6-story complex that serves the rural communities east of the city. I worked night maintenance there, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., Wednesday through Sunday. Good job. Decent pay, comprehensive benefits, and usually quiet enough that I could catch up on reading between service calls. The building had 2 main stairwells, east and west, plus a smaller emergency stair near the loading dock. Part of my routine was checking all the stairwell doors every night, making sure they were secure and the emergency lighting was functional. Safety regulations required testing the door mechanisms and verifying that the automatic locks were working properly. Standard procedure: walk to each landing, knock 3 times on the door to check for hollow sounds that might indicate damage, then test the handle and emergency release. Simple stuff, but important for fire safety compliance. The east stairwell always had good acoustics. Concrete construction with painted metal doors. Sounds carried clearly from floor to floor. When I knocked on a door, I could hear the echo bounce up and down the stairwell shaft, gradually fading as it reflected off the walls. Tuesday night, I was doing my routine check around midnight. Started at the ground floor, worked my way up. Each floor was the same. Knock 3 times, listen for structural issues, test the door mechanism. 3rd floor was different. I knocked 3 times on the door, sharp raps with my knuckles, spaced about 1 second apart. The sound echoed normally up the stairwell shaft, but as the echo was fading, I heard a 4th knock. Same tone, same volume as my knocks, but definitely additional. Like someone on another floor had added 1 more knock to my sequence. I stopped, listened carefully. The stairwell was quiet, except for the usual building sounds. HVAC system cycling, distant elevator machinery, the soft hum of fluorescent lights. No one else should have been in the stairwells at that hour. I knocked again. 3 deliberate raps. This time I heard 5 knocks come back. My 3 plus 2 additional knocks that seemed to come from somewhere above me in the shaft. I climbed to the 4th floor, repeated the test. 3 knocks from me, 4 knocks in response. The extra knock always came after a slight delay, just long enough to make it clear it wasn't part of the normal echo pattern. By the time I reached the 6th floor, the pattern was consistent. Whatever was producing the extra knocks seemed to be following me up the stairwell, always staying 1 floor ahead. At the top floor, I tried something different. Instead of 3 knocks, I knocked 4 times. 6 knocks came back. The additional knocks were always exactly 2 more than whatever I produced, and they had a different quality than my knocks, slightly deeper tone, like they were being made with something harder than knuckles. I keyed my radio, called the security desk. "You got anyone else in the building tonight? Maintenance, cleaning crew, anyone?" "Negative," came the reply. Just you and the overnight nursing staff. Why? Hearing some unusual sounds in the east stairwell. Might be worth checking the access logs. I'll pull the records. All the stairwell doors require badge access after hours, so we'll have a record if anyone's been using them. I finished my check and moved on to the other stairwells. West stairwell was normal, knocked 3 times, got normal echo patterns back. Emergency stair near the loading dock was also standard. But when I walked past the east stairwell an hour later, I could hear knocking coming from inside. Rhythmic pattern, 4 knocks, pause, 4 knocks, pause. Like someone was testing door after door, working their way down from the top floor. Security called me back around 2 a.m. Check the access logs for tonight. No badge entries for any of the stairwells since the day shift ended. But there's something weird. The east stairwell door sensors show multiple door openings and closings over the past week, all during night shift hours. Someone using emergency exit procedures. That's just it. Emergency exits create alarm events in the system. These logs show normal access, like someone was using a badge. But there's no corresponding badge data. I made a note to check the east stairwell doors more carefully the next night. Maybe someone had found a way to bypass the access control system. Wednesday night, I brought a flashlight and spent more time examining the stairwell doors. Everything looked normal. No signs of tampering with the locks. No unusual wear patterns around the handles. But when I tested the knocking procedure, the same thing happened. 3 knocks from me, 5 knocks in response. This time, I tried to track the source of the extra knocks. Stood very still, listened carefully to determine which direction they were coming from. The additional knocks seemed to be coming from directly above me, but not from the next floor. They sounded like they were coming from the stairwell shaft itself, maybe from the area between floors. I climbed half a flight, stopped on the landing between the 3rd and 4th floors. From there, I could see up into the shaft, where the emergency lighting cast shadows on the concrete walls. Something was different about the shadows. There were more of them than there should have been, considering the position of the lights. And one of the shadows seemed to be moving slightly, shifting position like someone was standing just outside the light pool. I aimed my flashlight up the shaft. The beam revealed normal concrete walls, metal railings, nothing unusual. But when I turned the light off, the extra shadow was back. I knocked 3 times, listened carefully. This time the response came from 2 directions. 2 additional knocks from above and 1 from below. Like multiple sources were responding to my signal. That's when I realized the knocking wasn't random. The extra knocks were following a pattern, always totaling exactly the same as my knocks plus 2. If I knocked once, I got 3 knocks back. 3 knocks got 5 back. 5 knocks got 7 back. Whatever was making the additional sounds was counting my knocks and responding with a mathematical relationship. Thursday night, I decided to test the pattern more systematically. Started with 1 knock, worked my way up to 10 knocks. Each time, the response was exactly my count plus 2. But around knock number 7, something changed. Instead of 9 knocks in response, I heard 7 knocks back. Perfect mimicry of my rhythm and timing, but without the additional 2 knocks. Like whatever was making the sounds had decided to copy my pattern exactly, instead of adding to it. I tried a complex rhythm. Knock knock, pause, knock pause, knock knock knock. The response came back identical. Same rhythm, same pauses. Perfect reproduction of my knocking pattern. By Friday night, the stairwell had become completely responsive. Whatever was in there would mirror any knocking pattern I produced, with perfect timing and identical tone quality. But it only worked in the east stairwell, and only during night shift hours. Day shift maintenance checked the stairwell during regular hours, found nothing unusual. No acoustic anomalies, no structural issues, no signs of unauthorized access. But the access logs continued to show phantom door activity during night shifts. Doors opening and closing without badge entries, always in sequence from top floor to bottom, like someone was systematically checking every level. I put in for a transfer to day shift the following week, told my supervisor I wanted more regular hours, which was partly true. But mainly, I didn't want to work in a building where the stairwells were counting my knocks and learning my patterns. The new night maintenance guy lasted 3 weeks before requesting a different assignment, said the east stairwell was too responsive for his comfort. Building management eventually had the stairwell acoustics professionally evaluated. The consultant found unusual sound reflection properties in the concrete construction, attributed to irregularities in the original pour. Recommended installing sound dampening materials to reduce echo effects. They installed the dampening materials last month. Haven't heard whether it solved the knocking problem. But I noticed the access logs still show phantom door activity in that stairwell. Same pattern, same hours, same sequence from top to bottom. Some problems can't be dampened. Furniture doesn't rearrange itself, but my kitchen chair seemed to have developed opinions about where it belonged. Every morning my kitchen chair was turned to face the back door instead of the table. I'd rented the duplex in Tillamook the first week of October, looking for something quiet while I finished a freelance writing project. Half of a converted Victorian, with my unit on the left side, and an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen on the right. Good neighborhood, walking distance to the library, close enough to the coast for weekend beach trips. The kitchen was small but functional, with a round table positioned near the window that overlooked the shared backyard. I kept one chair at the table for meals and work, positioned so I could look out at the Douglas firs while I ate breakfast and checked email. First week, everything was normal. I'd sit at the table with my coffee, work on the laptop, appreciate the quiet routine. Mrs. Chen was a considerate neighbor. I'd see her tending her garden in the mornings, but she kept to herself, and the duplex was well enough insulated that I rarely heard her moving around. The chair thing started on a Monday. I came into the kitchen for breakfast and found my chair turned around, facing away from the table toward the back door. Not just rotated, completely repositioned, moved about 3 feet from its usual spot, and oriented to give someone sitting in it a clear view of the backyard through the door's window. I assumed I'd bumped it the night before, maybe knocked it out of position while cleaning up after dinner. Put it back where it belonged and thought nothing more about it. Tuesday morning, same thing. Chair facing the back door, positioned like someone had deliberately arranged it for watching the yard. This time I paid attention to how I'd left the kitchen the night before. I specifically remembered pushing the chair under the table after dinner, the way I always did. But there it was again, moved and rotated to face the door. By Thursday, I was testing the pattern. Each night before bed, I'd position the chair carefully under the table, take a photo with my phone to document its exact placement. Each morning, I'd find it move to the same spot, facing the same direction, always toward the back door, always positioned for observation. I asked Mrs. Chen if she'd noticed anything unusual, mentioned that I was having some minor issues with furniture in the kitchen. She listened carefully, then shook her head. "I sleep soundly," she said. but I have noticed more activity in the backyard recently. Raccoons, maybe. They can be clever about getting into houses. Raccoons made some sense. Large enough to move a lightweight kitchen chair, smart enough to develop habitual behavior. But why would they consistently position the chair in exactly the same spot? I started leaving the kitchen light on at night, thinking that might discourage nocturnal wildlife from entering through whatever access point they'd found. But the chair continued to move. Second week, the pattern expanded. In addition to the kitchen chair, I started finding other furniture moved. The living room armchair, normally angled toward the TV, would be repositioned to face the front window. The desk chair in my home office would be turned away from the computer to face the closet door. All the movements followed the same principle. Furniture repositioned to face doors or windows, arranged for watching rather than for normal use. I did a thorough inspection of the duplex, looking for entry points. All the windows had secure latches, doors were solid with good deadbolts. No obvious way for wildlife to get inside, but I did find something odd near the back door. The floorboards just inside the threshold showed unusual wear patterns, scratches in the wood that formed roughly parallel lines, like something with claws had been walking back and forth across that spot. But the scratches were too large and too regularly spaced to be from raccoons. I mentioned the floor damage to the landlord, sent him photos of the scratches. He said he'd arrange for someone to look at it, maybe refinish that section of floor. But when the maintenance guy came out the following week, he was puzzled by the wear pattern. Almost looks like furniture legs, he said, examining the scratches, like someone was sliding a heavy chair back and forth across this spot. But these marks are too deep for normal furniture pads. That night, I decided to test something. Before going to bed, I arranged the kitchen chair in its normal position under the table, then scattered a thin layer of flour on the floor around it. If something was physically moving the chair, the flour would show footprints or drag marks. Thursday morning, the chair was in its usual moved position, facing the back door, but the flour showed something I wasn't expecting. Instead of footprints or drag marks, there were what looked like finger impressions in the flour. Long, thin marks, like someone had been feeling around on the floor with their hands. The marks formed a rough circle around where the chair had originally been positioned. But the finger marks were longer than human fingers. Each impression extended maybe 4 inches, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. I cleaned up the flour, reset the chair, tried to think rationally about what I was seeing. Maybe the wear patterns and flour marks had a simple explanation. Settlement in the old house causing floor movement, unusual temperature changes affecting the wood. But that night, I heard sounds from the kitchen, scraping noises like furniture being moved across the floor, soft but persistent, coming in regular intervals. I got up around 2 a.m. to investigate, found the kitchen empty with the chair back in its moved position. The back door window showed condensation in the shape of handprints. Multiple prints, overlapping, like someone had been pressing their palms against the glass from outside. I cleaned the window, went back to bed, but I could hear more scraping sounds throughout the night. And in the morning, I found that every piece of movable furniture in the duplex had been repositioned, all facing doors or windows, all arranged for watching. Friday evening, I installed a trail camera in the kitchen, hidden behind the microwave with a clear view of the table and back door. If something was moving the furniture, I wanted video evidence. Saturday morning, I checked the camera. 7 hours of footage showing the empty kitchen, chair under the table, everything normal. But around 3:30 a.m., the chair started moving, not being moved by anything visible. The chair simply slid across the floor on its own, rotating as it moved until it reached the familiar position facing the back door. The movement was smooth and deliberate, like the chair was being guided by invisible hands. But here's what made my blood run cold. After the chair finished moving, the camera captured something else. For just a few seconds, maybe 10 frames of video, there was a reflection in the back door window. A face, human-shaped but wrong somehow, with features that didn't quite align properly. Looking into the kitchen, watching the chair, watching the camera. When I tried to enhance the image, it became clear that the face was reflecting from inside the kitchen, not outside, like someone had been standing right behind the camera, looking over my shoulder while I slept. I packed that afternoon, told the landlord I'd had a family emergency and needed to break the lease early. He was understanding, said he'd return my deposit as long as I left the place clean. Mrs. Chen helped me load my car. As I was driving away, she mentioned something that stuck with me. The previous tenant left suddenly too, she said. Nice young man, very quiet, but he mentioned having trouble with the furniture moving around at night. I moved back to Portland, found a studio apartment on the 3rd floor of a modern building. Concrete construction, steel doors, windows that don't open far enough for anything larger than a house cat to squeeze through. The furniture stays where I put it, but sometimes late at night, I catch myself checking to make sure my desk chair is still facing the computer. Old habits from a place where something was always watching, always arranging the view to suit its own purposes. Mountain streams make a lot of sounds, but they shouldn't repeat the words you just spoke. The creek was repeating everything I said, but with a 3-second delay. I'd hiked into the Absaroka Range for a long weekend, targeting a drainage called Willow Wash that appeared on the map as a thin blue line with no trail markers. Remote country about 20 miles northeast of Cody, accessible only by cross-country hiking from the nearest forest road. The approach took most of Friday, 8 miles through dense lodgepole forest, then another 4 miles following game trails up the drainage toward the headwaters. By the time I found a good camp spot, the sun was already dropping behind the western ridges. Perfect location. Small meadow beside the creek, protected by a stand of ancient spruces, with clear views up the valley toward the peaks. The creek ran about 10 feet wide, shallow and clear, with that musical sound you get from water flowing over granite cobbles. I set up camp in the usual pattern. Tent position to catch the morning sun, kitchen area near the creek for easy water access, food bag hung from a sturdy limb well away from sleeping quarters. By the time I had everything squared away, dusk was settling into the drainage. Made dinner on the white gas stove. Just pasta and sauce, but it tasted perfect after the long hike. While I ate, I listened to the creek sounds. Constant gentle murmur, occasionally punctuated by the splash of water dropping over larger rocks. Peaceful, hypnotic. That's when I first noticed the pattern. I'd been talking to myself while I cooked, the way you do when you're alone in the backcountry. Nothing dramatic, just commenting on the gear, the weather, the scenery. Good camp spot. Water's cold, nice sunset, but the creek seemed to be responding. Not obviously, just subtle changes in the rhythm of the water flow. Moments when the steady murmur would shift slightly in tone and tempo. Almost like the stream was trying to match the cadence of my speech. I tested it. Said a simple phrase. Testing. 1, 2, 3. 3 seconds later, the creek's murmur changed. Same rhythm as my words, same emphasis pattern, like the water flow had been modulated to echo my speech. I tried a longer sentence. This is probably just coincidence. Again, 3-second delay. Then the creak sounds shifted to match my vocal rhythm, each syllable represented by a subtle change in water flow. By the time I finished dinner, I was convinced I was hearing things. Altitude, fatigue, maybe just the brain's tendency to find patterns in random noise. I cleaned up the dishes, hung the food bag, and went to bed early. Saturday morning, the phenomenon was more pronounced. I woke up around sunrise, made coffee on the stove. While the water heated, I called out to test the echo. "Good morning, Wyoming." 3 seconds later, the creek repeated my words back. Not as sound, as rhythm. The water flow modulated to perfectly match the stress patterns of my speech, turning my greeting into a liquid echo. I spent the morning exploring upstream, following the creek toward its source. The drainage narrowed as I climbed, rocky walls closing in on both sides. But everywhere I went, the creek seemed to be listening. When I spoke, the water would respond. When I was quiet, the stream returned to its normal steady murmur. The effect was strongest near my camp, but I could detect it for almost a mile upstream. Around noon, I found something that explained a part of the mystery. About half a mile above camp, the creek flowed through a narrow section where someone had built a series of small rock dams. Crude construction, just loose stones stacked to create pools and channels. But the placement was precise. Each dam positioned to control water flow in a specific way. The dams weren't random. They formed a pattern, with carefully calculated spacing between each structure. Water flowing through the modified channels would create different tones and rhythms, depending on the overall flow rate. Someone had turned the creek into a musical instrument, but the construction looked old. Stones covered with algae. Some of the smaller dams partially collapsed from spring runoff. This wasn't recent work. I followed the creek further upstream, found more modifications. Additional dams, channel diversions, even what looked like a primitive resonating chamber, built into a natural rock outcrop, all designed to amplify and modulate the sounds of flowing water. The whole system was maybe 2 miles long, following the creek from its headwaters down to just above my camp. Hundreds of hours of careful construction, all aimed at turning the stream into something that could mimic human speech patterns. But who would do this, and why? I made it back to camp around 4 p.m., spent the afternoon documenting what I'd found, took photos of the dam structures, tried to understand how the whole system worked. The engineering was sophisticated. Whoever built this understood acoustics and fluid dynamics. That evening, I tested the creek's response more systematically, tried different phrases, different rhythms, even singing. Each time, the water would respond with a 3-second delay, modulating its flow to match my vocal patterns. But around sunset, something changed. Instead of just echoing my speech patterns, the creek started producing new sounds. Complex rhythms I hadn't used, tonal patterns that sounded almost like words. Still obviously water flowing over stone, but shaped into something that resembled language. I listened carefully, trying to make out individual syllables. The sounds were almost familiar, like a language I'd heard before but couldn't quite place. Then I realized what I was hearing. The creek was playing back conversations. Not just my words from today, but phrases and sentences I'd spoken during the hike-in. Fragments of the commentary I'd made while navigating difficult terrain, setting up camp, cooking dinner. But mixed in with my own words were other voices. Different speakers, different conversations. Like the creek, had been recording and storing human speech for years, and was now playing back random selections from its collection. I heard a woman's voice. Beautiful country up here. A man's voice. Trails harder than I expected. Another woman. Good camp spot near the water. All delivered in the liquid rhythm of water flowing through the modified creek channel, but unmistakably human speech patterns. As darkness fell, the voices became more frequent. Dozens of different speakers, all saying things you'd expect to hear from backpackers and hikers, but some of the phrases were wrong. Help me find the trail back. I think I'm lost. Can anyone hear me? Distress calls delivered in the musical flow of the creek. Words that suggested people in trouble, calling for help that might never come. I packed my headlamp, moving quickly but quietly. Didn't want to spend another night listening to the creek play back the voices of people who might have camped in this drainage over the years. As I hiked out in the dark, I could hear the creek calling behind me. My own voice, saying things I'd never said. Don't leave me here. Come back. Help me. I made it back to the truck by midnight, drove straight home without stopping. Took 3 days before I could sleep properly, and weeks before I could listen to flowing water without hearing voices in the sound. But I kept thinking about those rock dams and the sophisticated engineering required to build them. Someone had spent years modifying that creek, turning it into a device that could capture and replay human speech. The question that bothered me was why? What was the purpose of building a system that could mimic the voices of people who passed through that remote drainage? And what happened to the people whose voices were stored in that liquid memory? I never went back to Willow Wash, but I did some research on missing persons reports for that area of Wyoming. Found more cases than I expected. Hikers and backpackers who'd gone into the Absaroka Range and never come out. Most of the reports mentioned the missing person's planned route included water sources in the high country, creeks and streams where they could filter water and set up camp, places where they might have talked to themselves while cooking dinner, unaware that something was listening, learning, and storing their voices for later use. Equipment placement is critical in a warehouse, so when the pallet jack kept shifting position, someone was going to get hurt. Every morning the pallet jack was rotated exactly 2 degrees from where I'd left it. Midwest Distribution operates a 100,000 square foot warehouse on the outskirts of Columbus, handling inventory for a dozen regional retailers. I worked night shift there for 3 years, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., Monday through Friday. Order picking, inventory management, general warehouse operations. The work required precision. Safety regulations were strict. Every piece of equipment had to be positioned exactly where it belonged at the end of each shift. Pallet jacks parked in designated zones, forklifts locked down with keys secured, everything staged for the day crew to start efficiently. I was particular about equipment placement. 20 years of warehouse work had taught me that sloppy habits lead to accidents. My pallet jack always got parked in the same spot near Bay 12, positioned perpendicular to the main aisle, with the handle pointing toward the loading dock. First time I noticed the rotation was a Tuesday morning. I came in for the night shift and found my pallet jack turned slightly clockwise from where I'd left it the previous evening. Not much, maybe 2 or 3 degrees, but enough to be noticeable if you paid attention to details. I figured day shift had used it and didn't quite get it back to the right position. No big deal. Repositioned it properly and got to work. Wednesday night, same thing. Thursday night, same thing. By Friday, I was paying closer attention to exactly how I positioned the jack at the end of my shift. Used the floor markings as reference points, made sure the handle aligned perfectly with the yellow safety lines. Friday morning, the jack was rotated clockwise again. This time, I measured the angle using the smartphone level app. Exactly 2 degrees off from where I'd positioned it. I mentioned it to Martinez, the day shift supervisor, asked if his crew had been using my equipment. "Nobody touches your jack," he said. "Day crew has their own equipment assignments, but I'll ask around, see if anyone noticed anything." The following week, the pattern continued. Every night, I'd position the pallet jack precisely. Every morning, I'd find it rotated exactly 2 degrees clockwise. Martinez confirmed that day shift wasn't using the equipment. They had their own jacks assigned to different bays. By the 3rd week, I was documenting everything. Photos of the pallet jack position at the end of my shift, measurements using the level app, detailed notes about the placement relative to floor markings. Every morning, 2 degree clockwise rotation. I asked building maintenance if there were any issues with the warehouse floor that might cause equipment to shift position, settling, temperature changes, vibration from nearby highway traffic. "Floor's been stable for 10 years, the maintenance supervisor told me. Concrete slab on grade, engineered for heavy equipment loads. If your jack is moving, something's physically relocating it." That's when I started thinking about security. The warehouse had a comprehensive camera system, motion sensors, and badge-controlled access. I requested footage for the area around Bay 12 during the hours between my shift and the start of day operations. Security reviewed 3 weeks of footage, found nothing unusual. The pallet jack appeared in its correct position at the end of my shift, then showed up rotated the next morning when day crew arrived. But the cameras never captured the actual movement. "Blind spotting coverage?" I asked. "Negative. That area has overlapping camera fields, motion detection, the works. If someone was moving your equipment, we'd have recorded it, but the jack kept rotating. 2 degrees clockwise every single night." 4th week, I expanded my documentation to include other equipment in the area. Marked the positions of everything within 50 feet of my pallet jack. Floor cleaners, safety equipment, even trash cans. Took photos, made measurements, created a detailed map of the equipment layout. Next morning, I found that everything had been rotated. Every piece of movable equipment in the area had been turned exactly 2 degrees clockwise from its original position. The pattern was too precise to be accidental. Someone, or something, was systematically repositioning equipment with mathematical precision. I called a meeting with warehouse management, presented my documentation. Photos, measurements, timestamps, security footage requests. The evidence was comprehensive and undeniable. "We'll install additional security measures," the operations manager promised. "Motion-activated cameras, vibration sensors, whatever it takes to identify the source of this issue." They installed the new security equipment over the weekend. High-resolution cameras with infrared capability, motion sensors sensitive enough to detect someone breathing, acoustic monitoring that could pick up footsteps or equipment being moved. Monday night, I worked my normal shift, positioned all the equipment precisely before clocking out at 7 a.m. Left everything perfectly aligned with the floor markings. Tuesday morning, everything had been rotated 2 degrees clockwise. Security reviewed 12 hours of footage from 6 different cameras. The new motion sensors hadn't triggered. The acoustic monitors recorded normal building sounds, HVAC systems, minor settling, distant highway traffic. But at 4:17 a.m., every camera in the warehouse simultaneously showed the same anomaly. For exactly 30 seconds, all the equipment in Bay 12 area appeared to rotate slowly clockwise, not being moved by any visible force. The equipment simply turned on its own, in perfect synchronization. The security director called it a system malfunction. Multiple camera failure, probably caused by electromagnetic interference from the new motion sensors. We'll have the system recalibrated. But I'd been in the warehouse that morning around 4:17 a.m. doing inventory counts in Bay 8. I'd heard the sound, metallic scraping, like heavy equipment being dragged across concrete, coming from the direction of Bay 12, lasting about 30 seconds. I'd assumed day crew had come in early and was moving equipment around. But when I'd walked over to check, the area had been empty. All the equipment in its normal positions, nothing disturbed, except everything was rotated 2 degrees clockwise from where I'd left it the night before. 5th week, I decided to stay late and monitor Bay 12 directly. Clocked out at normal time, but remained in the building, hidden behind a stack of pallets with a clear view of my equipment area. Around 4 a.m., the temperature in the warehouse dropped noticeably. Not gradually. It was like someone had opened a freezer door. My breath started showing in the air, and I could see frost forming on the metal equipment. That's when the rotation started. The pallet jack began turning slowly clockwise, moving smoothly as if it were on a turntable. No visible force acting on it. No sound except for a faint scraping of wheels on concrete. The movement was precise, mechanical, stopping at exactly 2 degrees of rotation. Then, every other piece of equipment in the area began moving. Floor cleaner, safety gear, even the trash cans, all rotating in perfect synchronization. The movements were so coordinated it looked like choreography. The rotation lasted 30 seconds, then stopped. Temperature returned to normal immediately, frost disappearing as quickly as it had formed. I stayed hidden for another hour, but nothing else happened. At sunrise, I came out and checked the equipment positions. Everything was rotated exactly 2 degrees clockwise from where I'd positioned it the night before. I put in my 2 weeks' notice that morning, told management I'd found a position with better benefits, which was true enough. But mainly, I didn't want to work in a building where the equipment moved itself according to some incomprehensible schedule. The replacement night shift worker lasted 6 weeks before requesting a transfer to day operations. Said the equipment in Bay 12 had behavioral issues that made him uncomfortable working alone. Building management eventually hired a consulting firm to investigate the phenomenon. They installed electromagnetic field detectors, temperature monitoring systems, even brought in a structural engineer to check for foundation issues. The consultants concluded that the rotation was caused by minor seismic activity combined with asymmetric thermal expansion in the concrete slab. They recommended installing vibration dampeners under the equipment. But the night shift crews still report that equipment in Bay 12 moves on its own. Always the same rotation, always the same timing, and always exactly 2 degrees clockwise. When the headlight wash from security sweeps caught the warehouse windows during my final week, I could see shadows moving inside Bay 12, long after the equipment had finished its nightly rotation. Tall figures walking among the machinery like they were inspecting their work. But the cameras never recorded those shadows. Some things are only visible to people who work the night shift. Security cameras record what happens, but they shouldn't record nights that never occurred. My security camera recorded 8 hours of footage from a night I wasn't home. I'd moved to the townhouse in Bozeman in August. a 2-bedroom place on the outskirts of town with mountain views and reasonable rent. The neighborhood was quiet, mostly young professionals and graduate students from the university. Safe enough that I didn't think much about security until my car got broken into the second week. Nothing valuable stolen, but it made me conscious of being a single woman living alone. I installed a basic security system, door sensors, motion detectors, and a wireless camera that monitored the living room and front entrance. The camera was a simple model, motion activated with night vision capability. It recorded to an SD card that I'd check every few days, mostly just to see delivery drivers and the occasional neighbor walking their dog. October 15th, I drove down to Missoula for a friend's birthday party, planning to stay overnight and drive back Sunday morning. Left around 6 p.m. Friday, set the alarm system, locked up the house. The party ran late. I crashed at my friend's place, slept in until noon Saturday, then spent the afternoon hiking in the Rattlesnake before driving home Sunday evening. When I got back, the alarm system was still armed, no signs of intrusion. But I decided to check the security camera footage anyway, just to be thorough. That's when I found the problem. According to the camera's timestamp, it had recorded continuously from Friday night through Sunday morning. 8 hours of footage for each night, showing normal activity in my living room. But I hadn't been home either night. The first night's footage showed me coming into the living room around 10 p.m., doing normal evening activities, reading on the couch, checking my phone, getting ready for bed. The person in the video looked exactly like me, moved like me, even wore clothes from my closet. But I'd been in Missoula, documented with photos from the birthday party and restaurant receipts. Saturday night's footage was even more detailed. 8 hours of me going through my normal home routine, cooking dinner in the kitchen, visible from the camera angle, watching TV, working on my laptop. All typical activities, all perfectly ordinary. Except I'd been hiking near Missoula and sleeping in my friend's guest room. I checked the SD card timestamp against my phone's photo metadata. The camera showed me at home at exactly the same time my phone photos proved I was 200 miles away. The camera wasn't malfunctioning. The image quality was clear. The motion detection had triggered properly. The timestamp alignment was perfect. But it had somehow recorded me being home when I definitely wasn't. I called the camera manufacturer's technical support, described the issue. They walked me through various diagnostic procedures, had me check the system settings and review the installation. Memory cards can occasionally corrupt, the technician explained. Sometimes you get duplicate footage, timestamp errors, files that appear to be from different dates. Try reformatting the card and see if the problem persists. I reformatted the SD card, but kept copies of the impossible footage. Something about it bothered me beyond the technical anomaly. The person in the video moved exactly like me, but there were subtle differences. Slightly different posture when sitting on the couch, a minor variation in how I typically held my phone. Close enough to be unmistakably me, but with small details that felt off. 2 weeks later, it happened again. I spent the weekend in Seattle visiting family, left Friday afternoon, and returned Sunday night. The security system showed no intrusions, but the camera had recorded footage of me being home both nights. This time, I watched the video more carefully. The person who looked like me was wearing a sweater I'd definitely packed for the Seattle trip. And at one point in Saturday's footage, she answered her phone with my voice. I could hear my side of a conversation I'd never had, discussing plans for Sunday that I'd never made. The voice was identical to mine, but the words were unfamiliar. That's when I realized someone had been in my house. Not a typical break-in. Nothing was missing, nothing was disturbed, but someone had been there, living my normal routine, wearing my clothes, using my phone, and somehow the security camera was recording them as if they were me. I installed additional cameras, hidden models that recorded to cloud storage instead of local SD cards. If someone was manipulating my security system, I wanted backup footage they couldn't access. The next time I traveled, I got recordings from both systems. The original camera showed the usual impossible footage, me at home when I wasn't. But the hidden cameras recorded something different. They showed empty rooms for most of the weekend. But around midnight each night, the motion sensors would trigger. The hidden camera footage was strange. It showed someone moving through my house, but the image quality was poor. Blurred figures, shadows that didn't correspond to the lighting, movements that seemed too quick or too slow for normal human behavior. But when the blurred figure stood in front of the main security camera, that camera recorded clear footage of me going through my normal routine. Like the main camera was seeing one thing, while the hidden cameras recorded something else entirely. I brought both sets of footage to a local security consultant, asked for a technical analysis. He reviewed everything carefully, ran tests on the equipment, checked for signs of tampering. "Your main camera's been modified," he concluded. "Someone's installed additional hardware that intercepts the video signal and substitutes different footage." Sophisticated work probably requires access to the device for several hours to make the modifications. How would someone get access? They'd need to be inside your house, with the camera dismounted and the security system disarmed. This isn't something you could do quickly. I checked my travel records against the camera's installation date. The modifications had to have been made during one of my weekend trips, probably the first time the impossible footage appeared. Someone had been in my house for hours, working on my security system, learning my routines, and they'd been coming back regularly, using my absence to practice being me. The mouse nest ammonia smell started showing up around that time. Sharp and acrid, strongest in the living room, near where the main camera was mounted, like someone had been marking territory inside the house. When I checked the original footage's EXIF data, I found timestamps that showed the recordings had been made during starfield gaps, astronomical events that occur when certain constellations are obscured by atmospheric distortion. But the gaps in the timestamps corresponded exactly to moments when I'd been provably elsewhere, documented with receipts and photos. Someone had been using astronomical data to time their visits, knowing when I'd be away and when the natural lighting conditions would mask their activities. I moved out the following week, found a studio apartment closer to campus with professional security management, left most of my furniture, told the landlord I'd had a family emergency, but I kept the footage. Sometimes I watch it when I can't sleep, trying to understand what I'm seeing. The person who looks like me but isn't quite right, living my life in an empty house while I'm away. The movements are getting more accurate with each recording, more natural, more like my actual mannerisms, like something was learning to be me by practicing in my absence. Emergency radios are for safety, but when Channel 7 starts broadcasting your own voice back to you, safety becomes relative. My radio is picking up transmissions from my own campsite. I'd driven out to the Ruby Mountains for a 3-day camping trip, planning to hike up to the old fire tower on Mount Wheeler, remote country about 50 miles east of Elko, accessible by forest roads that most people wouldn't attempt without 4-wheel drive. The campsite was perfect, flat meadow about 2 miles below the tower, protected by a grove of ancient bristlecone pines. No cell service, no other campers. Just the kind of deep wilderness quiet you can only find in Nevada's backcountry. I always carry an emergency radio on solo trips, a handheld FRS unit with weather channels and emergency broadcast capability. Standard safety equipment for anyone venturing into roadless areas. The radio lived in my day pack, set to monitor Channel 1 for any ranger or emergency traffic. First night was peaceful. Set up camp, made dinner, watched the stars come out in that crystal clear desert air. The radio stayed quiet except for occasional atmospheric static and distant weather updates from Reno. Friday morning, I hiked up to the fire tower, spent most of the day exploring the summit area. The old lookout had been abandoned for decades, but the metal framework was still intact. Good views in all directions. You could see for 100 miles across the basin and range country. Around noon, I decided to test my radio coverage from the tower. Keyed up Channel 1, called the Ranger Station in Elko, to let them know my location and status. Ruby Mountain Ranger Station. This is Solo Hiker at Mount Wheeler Fire Tower. Radio check, over. No response. Not unusual. I was probably outside their normal coverage area, but as I was putting the radio away, I heard something that made me stop. Static burst on Channel 7, then a voice. Ruby Mountain Ranger Station. This is Solo Hiker at Mount Wheeler Fire Tower. Radio check, over. My voice. Exactly my voice, with the same timing and inflection I just used on Channel 1. I checked the radio display. Channel 7 was active, showing transmission activity, but I was the only person within miles of the tower. I switched to Channel 7, listened carefully. Nothing but carrier wave static. Switched back to Channel 1, continued monitoring, but every few minutes Channel 7 would activate with transmissions in my voice. Testing, testing. Beautiful view from up here. Radio check, over. All phrases I'd spoken while hiking or at the tower, but broadcast on a channel I wasn't using. By afternoon, I was documenting the anomaly. Set the radio to scan all channels, made notes about transmission timing and content. Channel 7 was definitely active, broadcasting regularly, but only with recordings of my own voice. I hiked back to camp around 4 p.m., radio quiet for most of the descent. But as I approached the meadow, Channel 7 came alive again. Good camp spot. Water's clean. Nice sunset. Comments I'd made the previous evening while setting up camp, now being broadcast from somewhere in the immediate area. I walked the perimeter of my campsite, using the radio's signal strength indicator to triangulate the transmission source. The strongest signal came from a cluster of bristlecone pines about 50 yards from my tent. But there was nothing there. No radio equipment, no antennas, no signs of recent human activity. Just ancient trees and scattered granite boulders. That evening, I tested the phenomenon systematically. Spoke various phrases while monitoring Channel 7 on a second radio I carried for backup. Every comment I made would be rebroadcast on Channel 7 within 10 to 15 minutes. But the rebroadcast timing was getting shorter. By the time I went to bed, Channel 7 was echoing my words, within seconds of when I spoke them. Saturday morning, the pattern changed. Instead of just repeating words I'd already said, Channel 7 started broadcasting things I was about to say. I'd think about commenting on the weather, and Channel 7 would transmit. Looks like rain building to the west. Then I'd speak the same words out loud, usually within a few seconds of the transmission. The radio was somehow picking up my thoughts and broadcasting them before I vocalized them. I tested this carefully. thinking specific phrases and waiting to see if they'd appear on Channel 7. The accuracy was disturbing. About 80% of my conscious thoughts were being transmitted before I spoke them. Around noon, I heard something that changed everything. Channel 7 transmitted. I need to get out of here. Something's wrong with the radio. Words I'd been thinking but hadn't spoken. And immediately after the transmission, I felt compelled to say the same words out loud. Like the radio wasn't just reading my thoughts, it was influencing them. I packed up and started hiking out, but Channel 7 continued transmitting. Now it was broadcasting a running commentary of my evacuation, including thoughts and observations I hadn't yet formulated. Trail's harder going down. Should reach the truck by 3 p.m. Need to report this to the rangers. All accurate predictions of what I would think and say over the next few hours. By the time I reached the truck, I was convinced someone was playing an elaborate prank. High-tech surveillance equipment, voice recording and transmission gear. Maybe even some kind of thought-reading technology. But when I got back to Elko and reported the incident to the rangers, they were interested for a different reason. You're the third person this month to report radio anomalies in that area, the ranger told me. Always the same thing. Transmissions that sound like the hiker's own voice, broadcasting on channels they're not using. What do you think is causing it? Could be atmospheric conditions, unusual radio propagation. That high desert country can do strange things to electromagnetic signals. But he looked concerned when he said it. I did some research when I got home. Found reports of similar radio anomalies in remote areas throughout Nevada. Always the same pattern. Hikers and campers hearing their own voices broadcast on unused channels, often with predictive content that preceded their actual thoughts. Most people attributed it to equipment malfunction or atmospheric interference. But the reports were too consistent, too detailed to be random technical problems. And they all came from areas near abandoned fire towers. The moon broke through clouds as I drove away from the Ruby Mountains that final evening, casting strange shadows on the desert floor. In my rearview mirror, I could see lights moving on Mount Wheeler. Not electric lights, but something that pulsed in rhythm with radio transmissions. I never went back to that area, but I kept the radio recordings, and sometimes I listen to them when I'm trying to understand what happened. The most disturbing part isn't hearing my own voice transmitted back to me. It's listening to thoughts I hadn't yet had, words I was going to speak before I knew I was going to speak them. Like something was inside my head, learning how I think, practicing being me from the inside out. The guy line on my tent that morning had been retied with a clove hitch instead of my usual trucker's hitch. Small detail, but it suggested someone had been at my campsite during the night, examining my gear, learning my habits. Someone who knew how to tie knots but preferred different techniques than mine. Public buildings have intercom systems, but they shouldn't work when they're not connected to anything. The intercom was making announcements, but it had been disconnected for 3 months. Great Lakes Regional Library is a 4-story building on the Detroit waterfront, serving 6 counties with research materials and digital archives. I worked night custodial there, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., Tuesday through Saturday. Quiet job, good pay, and I liked the solitude of having the entire building to myself. The intercom system had been shut down in July after a renovation project updated the building's communications infrastructure. Old analog system, hardwired throughout the building with speakers in every major room. The new setup was all wireless, controllable from tablets and smartphones. Facilities management had disconnected the old intercom completely, cut the main power feed, removed the control console, even pulled some of the wiring from the walls. The speakers were still mounted, but they were just empty metal boxes with no electrical connection. October 12th. I was working in the third floor reference section when I heard the first announcement. Attention library staff. Building security check in progress. Please remain at your current locations. Clear, professional announcement coming from the old intercom speakers. Same tone and cadence as the announcements we used to hear when the system was operational. But the system had been dead for 3 months. I checked the main electrical panel, confirmed that the intercom circuit breakers were still off, walked down to the basement, examined the control room where the old console had been removed. Everything disconnected, no power going to any part of the system. But the speakers continued making announcements. Custodial staff, please report to the main desk for special instructions. That got my attention. I was the only custodial staff on duty, and there was nobody at the main desk to give instructions. I went down to the lobby, found it empty as expected. But as I approached the circulation desk, another announcement came through the speakers. Marcus Reed, please check your mobile phone for important messages. My name, my actual name, which wasn't listed anywhere in the building directory or on my name tag. I checked my phone. No new messages, no missed calls. But the intercom seemed to know who I was and wanted my attention. Over the next hour, the announcements became more frequent and more specific. Marcus, the books on Cart 7 need to be reshelved in section 400. Please check the restroom on the second floor for maintenance issues. The coffee maker in the staff room has been left on. All accurate information. Cart 7 did have books that needed reshelving. The second floor restroom did have a minor plumbing leak I'd been planning to address, and I had left the coffee maker on in the staff room. But how could a disconnected intercom system know these details? I decided to test the system's knowledge, deliberately left the window open in the fourth floor reading room, then waited to see if the intercom would mention it. 10 minutes later, please secure the window in the northeast reading room before continuing with other duties. Accurate location, appropriate instruction. Like someone was monitoring my work and providing guidance through the dead intercom system. But the building was empty. Security cameras showed no one else in the facility, and all the entrances were locked and alarmed. Around 2 a.m., the announcement started including information the intercom shouldn't have had access to. Marcus Reed, your vehicle registration expires next month. Please remember to call your dentist about the appointment scheduling. Your sister Jessica called this afternoon about dinner plans. Personal information that wasn't stored anywhere in the library's systems. Details from my private life that I'd never discussed at work. I called building security, reported the intercom malfunction. They promised to send someone out during business hours to investigate, but the announcements continued. Security has been notified about the intercom issue. Response time will be approximately 6 hours. Please continue with normal duties while waiting for technical support. Do not attempt to locate the source of these announcements. That last one bothered me. Like the system didn't want me investigating how it was functioning without power. But I investigated anyway. Started in the basement, tracing the old intercom wiring that hadn't been completely removed. Found several junction boxes where the original wiring connected to speaker feeds throughout the building. All supposedly disconnected. But I noticed something odd about the wire nuts. They'd been recently disturbed. Fresh copper visible where wires had been stripped and reconnected. Someone had been doing electrical work on the old intercom system. I followed the wire paths through the building, checking each connection point. Most of the original wiring was still in place, just disconnected at the main panel. But someone had bypassed the control room entirely, creating a new power feed from an unknown source. On the 4th floor, I found a modification. Hidden behind a false ceiling panel was a small electronic device connected to the old intercom wiring. Sophisticated piece of equipment with multiple antennas, battery backup, and what looked like a microprocessor unit. The device was warm to the touch and humming quietly. Active electronics, clearly the source of the rogue announcements. But here's what disturbed me. The device had no obvious input connections. No microphone, no radio receiver, no network cable. Yet it was somehow gathering information about building activities and my personal life. As I examined the equipment, the intercom speakers activated. "Marcus, please step away from the device and return to your normal duties. The equipment you have discovered is not your concern. Facilities management will address this issue during regular business hours." Direct references to what I was doing, delivered in real time, like the device was monitoring me and responding to my actions. I took photos of the hidden equipment, documented its location and connections. But when I checked the photos later, they showed only empty ceiling space. The device was somehow not visible to my phone's camera. The reflective tags I used to mark my cleaning route had been repositioned while I was investigating the intercom system. Instead of marking my normal path through the building, they now formed arrows pointing toward emergency exits, like something wanted me to leave the building quickly. The rest of the night the announcements continued, but with a different tone. "Excellent work on the reference section cleaning. Please ensure all windows are secured before leaving tonight. Your shift performance has been noted and appreciated." Positive feedback, but with an underlying edge that suggested I was being watched and evaluated. When day shift arrived at 8 a.m., I reported the intercom issue to the head librarian. She was skeptical until the speakers activated while we were talking. "Good morning, Doctor. Patterson, the building is secure and ready for normal operations." She knew her name, her title, even though she'd never been mentioned in any of the previous announcements. Facilities management sent a technician out that afternoon. He found the hidden device exactly where I described it, but when he tried to remove it, the intercom system activated with a new message. "This equipment is protected by federal regulations. Unauthorized removal is prohibited. Please contact the appropriate authorities before proceeding. Building management will be notified of compliance requirements." The technician backed off, said he'd need to check with his supervisors before touching anything that claimed federal protection. That was 6 months ago. The device is still there, still making announcements through the supposedly disconnected intercom system. Facilities management says they're researching the regulatory requirements before taking any action. But the announcements have become more personal, more intrusive. They comment on staff conversations, provide reminders about personal appointments, even offer suggestions about work efficiency improvements. Like something is learning about everyone who works in the building, gathering information through methods that don't show up on security cameras or electronic monitoring systems. I transferred to day shift last month, told them I wanted more regular hours, which was true enough. But really, I didn't want to be alone in a building where the walls were listening and talking back. The smell of ozone lingered around the hidden device whenever I checked on it during my final weeks on night shift. Sharp and clean, like the air after a lightning strike. But there were never any storms in the forecast. Mechanical systems make noise, but they shouldn't sound like someone trying to match your breathing pattern. The boiler was breathing in sync with me. I'd rented the basement apartment in Scottsdale as a temporary place while I looked for something permanent. Converted basement in a 1980s ranch house, separate entrance, utilities included. The landlord lived upstairs with his family, nice enough people who kept to themselves. The boiler room was adjacent to my living area, separated by a thin wall that let through most of the mechanical sounds. Normal stuff, gas burner cycling on and off, water pump activation, expansion tank pressure changes. Background noise you get used to after a few nights. Third week, I started noticing the breathing pattern. Late at night, when I was reading in bed, the boiler would make a rhythmic sound. Soft hiss of gas flow, pause, then the gentle whoosh of the burner shutting down, like someone taking slow, deep breaths in the next room. At first, I thought it was just the normal heating cycle. Gas boilers have natural rhythms based on thermostat settings and heat demand. But this pattern was different, too regular, too synchronized with quiet moments in the apartment. I timed it. The boiler's breathing cycle matched mine almost exactly. When I breathed slowly while reading, the system would hiss and pause at the same intervals. When I held my breath, the boiler would go silent, too. October nights got cool enough that the heating system ran more frequently. That's when the synchronization became obvious. I'd be lying in bed, breathing normally, and the boiler would match my rhythm perfectly. Inhale, gas hiss. Exhale, burner shut down. The timing was so precise, it felt like the system was listening to me breathe and adjusting its operation accordingly. I mentioned it to the landlord, asked if there were any issues with the heating system. Been running fine for 15 years, he said, but I can have a technician look at it if you're hearing unusual sounds. It's probably nothing. Just seems to run in a weird rhythm sometimes. These old boilers have personalities. You'll get used to it. But I wasn't getting used to it. The breathing synchronization was becoming more pronounced, especially during quiet evening hours when I was trying to relax. I started testing the pattern deliberately. Would change my breathing rhythm while sitting quietly. See if the boiler would adjust to match. Deep breaths, shallow breaths, irregular patterns. The system responded to all of them. Around Halloween, I noticed the breathing wasn't just synchronized. It was predictive. The boiler would start its cycle a few seconds before I inhaled, like it was anticipating my breathing pattern. When I tried to break the rhythm by holding my breath, the system would pause too, but it would resume breathing cycles just before I needed to exhale, like something was inside my head, knowing when I needed to breathe before I did. I called a heating contractor, asked for an independent inspection of the system, told him I was concerned about carbon monoxide or other safety issues. He spent 2 hours examining the boiler, testing all the safety systems and gas connections. Everything checked out normal. Proper installation, good ventilation, all safety devices functioning correctly. Systems in excellent condition, he reported, operating exactly the way it should. What about the cycling patterns? Does the timing seem normal? He listened to the boiler operation for a few minutes. Sounds fine to me. Maybe a little more frequent cycling than I'd expect. But that could be due to the thermostat location or insulation issues. But he wasn't listening at night, when the breathing patterns were most obvious. November brought colder weather and longer heating cycles. The breathing synchronization became so precise that I started having trouble sleeping. Every time I tried to relax, I'd become conscious of the boiler matching my respiratory rhythm. And it wasn't just breathing anymore. The water heater started making sounds that matched my heartbeat when I was lying still. Rapid cycling of the heating element, timed to coincide with my pulse rate. The refrigerator compressor would adjust its vibration pattern to synchronize with whatever music I was listening to. All the mechanical systems in the apartment were somehow tuning themselves to my biological rhythms. I installed a carbon monoxide detector, thinking gas exposure might be causing hallucinations or heightened sensitivity to sound. The detector showed normal levels, but I noticed something odd about its operation. The alarm status light would blink in sync with my breathing. Not the normal steady flash pattern, a custom rhythm that matched whatever respiratory rate I was maintaining. Even the safety equipment was synchronizing with my body. I set up a recording device to document the phenomenon, left it running overnight to capture the breathing patterns. But when I reviewed the audio, the boiler sounded completely normal. Typical heating system operation. No obvious synchronization with anything. Yet I could still hear the breathing pattern clearly when I was in the apartment. December, I found the modification. While moving some storage boxes, I discovered an access panel behind the water heater that I'd never noticed before. Inside was a small electronic device connected to the gas control lines of both the boiler and water heater. Sophisticated equipment with multiple sensors and what looked like a wireless communication module. The device was warm and humming quietly, clearly active. But what disturbed me was the labeling. Handwritten tags on various wires, respiratory monitor, cardiac sync, audio pattern match. Someone had installed equipment to monitor my biological functions and synchronize the mechanical systems accordingly. I photographed the device, then tried to trace its installation history. When I asked the landlord about recent work on the heating system, he was evasive. Might have had some efficiency upgrades done last year, he said. Can't remember exactly what the technician installed. Do you have the invoices or work orders? I'll look for them and get back to you. He never got back to me. That night, the synchronization became aggressive. Instead of just matching my breathing, the boiler started trying to control it. Rapid cycling that made me feel like I needed to breathe faster. Then slow cycles that made me want to hold my breath. The systems were no longer following my biological rhythms. They were trying to influence them. I lit the white gas camp stove I kept for emergencies. Watched the blue flame flare to life. The steady hiss was comforting, a sound that remained constant while everything else in the apartment seemed to be watching and responding to my vital signs. I packed and moved out the next morning, told the landlord I'd found a place closer to work. He seemed relieved rather than disappointed about losing a tenant. As I loaded my car, I noticed something that confirmed my suspicions. The house next door had a small antenna mounted on the roof, pointed directly at the basement apartment I'd been renting. And there was a man sitting in a car across the street, watching me load my belongings. When I looked directly at him, he started the engine and drove away. I found a new apartment in Tempe, third floor of a modern complex with all electric systems. No gas appliances, no boiler, no mechanical systems that could be easily modified for biological monitoring. But sometimes late at night, I catch myself listening to the air conditioning, checking to see if it's synchronizing with my breathing. Old habits probably, but after living with systems that were watching and learning, it's hard to trust any mechanical sounds, even the ones that seem completely normal. The chair in my new apartment stays exactly where I put it. No mysterious rotations, no repositioning to face windows or doors. But I've noticed that when I work late, the air conditioning adjusts its cycle to match my typing rhythm. Small detail, probably just coincidence, but I've learned to pay attention to the patterns that mechanical systems develop around human behavior. Mountain photography requires patience, but when your camera captures more shadows than there are objects to cast them, patience becomes concern. My camera was photographing shadows that didn't belong to anything. I'd driven up to the Sawtooth Wilderness for a week-long photography trip, planning to capture the fall aspen colors before the first hard freeze. September in Idaho's high country, perfect weather for hiking with camera gear, and the tourist crowds had mostly cleared out after Labor Day. Aspen Saddle is a high mountain pass, about 12 miles from the nearest trailhead, accessible only by foot through some of the most spectacular alpine scenery in the lower 48. I'd been planning this trip for months, waiting for the right combination of weather and foliage conditions. The hike-in took most of Thursday, heavy packed loaded with camera equipment and camping gear. I set up a base camp in a protected meadow, just below the saddle, perfect position for sunrise and sunset photography sessions. First evening, I shot about 200 images during golden hour. Classic mountain photography capturing the aspen groves as they caught the last angled sunlight. Beautiful conditions, dramatic lighting, exactly what I'd hoped for. But when I reviewed the images that night, I found something odd. Most of the photos looked normal, but about a dozen showed additional shadows that I didn't remember seeing during the shoot. Long, human-shaped shadows extending from the aspen groves, but not corresponding to any trees or rocks that should have cast them. I checked the shooting locations against my notes, tried to figure out what might have created the extra shadows, but the terrain didn't match. No objects in the right positions to cast shadows of that size and orientation. Digital photography can create artifacts, especially in challenging lighting conditions, but these shadows looked completely natural, properly aligned with the sun angle and integrated seamlessly into the overall image composition. Friday morning, I was more careful about documenting my shooting positions. Took reference photos of each location before setting up the tripod. Made detailed notes about lighting conditions and potential shadow sources. Same thing happened. About 10% of my images showed additional shadows that weren't visible when I was actually taking the photos. This time, I noticed something else. The shadows appeared to be moving between shots. I'd taken a series of images from the same tripod position, adjusting only the exposure settings. But the mysterious shadows showed up in different positions across the sequence, like someone was walking around in the aspen grove during the few seconds between exposures. But I was alone in the wilderness. No other hikers, no wildlife large enough to cast human-sized shadows. I started testing the phenomenon systematically, set up the camera on the tripod, composed a shot that included several of the mystery shadows from previous images. Then I'd take a photo, immediately reposition for a slightly different angle, and shoot again. The shadows were consistent within each individual image, but they'd change position between shots taken just seconds apart. Like multiple figures were moving through the aspen grove, staying just out of my direct vision, but visible to the camera sensor. Friday afternoon, I tried something different. Set the camera to rapid fire mode. Took burst sequences of 10 images in quick succession. If something was moving around in the grove, the burst mode should capture it in motion. The results were disturbing. Each image in the sequence showed the mysterious shadows in slightly different positions, creating a stop-motion effect of figures walking through the aspen trees. But the movement patterns were wrong. Too fluid, too coordinated to be random wildlife or natural phenomena. And the shadows seemed to be aware of the camera. In several burst sequences, the shadow figures appeared to turn toward the camera position. as if they'd noticed the rapid shutter activity and were looking in my direction. Saturday, I checked the camera's EXIF data more carefully, looking for technical explanations. Shutter speed, aperture, ISO settings. Everything looked normal, but I found something odd in the file timestamps. According to the metadata, some of the images had been taken before I'd actually pressed the shutter button. Timestamps showing exposures made several seconds prior to when I triggered the camera, but that was impossible. Digital cameras record the exact moment the sensor is exposed, synchronized with the camera's internal clock. I tested the camera's timing against my phone's clock, verified that the internal time was accurate, but the phantom images continued to show impossible timestamps, suggesting the camera was somehow taking pictures on its own. That evening, I heard the shutter sounds. I was reading in my tent around sunset when I heard the familiar click-whir of my camera taking photos. Sharp, metallic sounds coming from where I'd left the camera gear about 20 feet away. I grabbed my headlamp and investigated. The camera was sitting exactly where I'd left it, powered down and with the lens cap secured. But when I checked the memory card, there were 3 new images. All showed my campsite from the camera's perspective, but with additional figures visible in the shadows around my tent. Human-shaped silhouettes standing just outside the circle of light from my camp stove. Figures that hadn't been there when I'd walked over to check the camera. I packed the camera gear inside my tent, kept it within arm's reach for the rest of the night, but I could still hear occasional shutter sounds coming from outside the tent, like multiple cameras taking pictures from different angles around my campsite. Sunday morning, I found evidence that confirmed my suspicions. Pressed into the soft earth around my tent were footprints, large prints, bigger than mine, with an unusual stride pattern. The tracks showed someone circling my campsite repeatedly during the night, pausing at positions that corresponded exactly to where the phantom shutter sounds had come from. But the most disturbing discovery was near where I'd originally left the camera. There, carefully arranged in a circle, were several small electronic devices that I didn't recognize. Circuit boards with camera sensors, connected by thin wires to what looked like miniature radio transmitters. The devices were warm to the touch and humming quietly, clearly active. Someone had been using my photography trip as cover to install surveillance equipment. And somehow, they'd modified my camera to synchronize with their hidden network, creating a comprehensive monitoring system disguised as random camera malfunctions. I photographed the hidden devices, then packed up and started hiking out immediately. Didn't want to spend another night in an area where someone was watching my every move through hidden cameras. As I broke camp, I heard the shutter sounds again. But this time, they were coming from multiple directions. Left, right, behind me. Like a coordinated photo session documenting my departure. When I checked my camera later, it had indeed taken photos during the packing process. Images of me loading my gear, breaking down the tent, preparing to leave. All taken from angles that should have been impossible given where I'd positioned the camera. The metadata showed the photos had been triggered remotely, synchronized with the hidden surveillance network I'd discovered. The reflective tacks I used to mark my gear had been repositioned during the night, arranged to point toward the trail leading out of the saddle, like someone wanted to make sure I knew which direction to go. I reported the incident to the Forest Service when I reached the trailhead, described the surveillance equipment, and provided GPS coordinates for the installation site. They promised to investigate, but when they sent a team to the location 3 days later, they found nothing. The electronic devices had been removed, leaving only the footprints and some disturbed soil where the equipment had been placed. But they did find something interesting. The trees in the aspen grove showed signs of recent modification. Small holes drilled into trunks at eye level, perfectly positioned for camera lenses. And several trees had thin wire runs that suggested a hidden power and communication network. Someone had turned the wilderness area into a sophisticated surveillance operation, using the natural cover of the aspen grove to hide cameras and monitoring equipment. The mystery shadows in my photographs weren't technical artifacts or supernatural phenomena. They were the surveillance team, moving through their hidden network while documenting visitors to the area. I never found out who was running the operation or why they'd chosen that particular wilderness location. But I did learn to be more careful about where I take photography trips. Some places are more photogenic than others, and some of them are photographing back. The smell of ozone lingered around the hidden surveillance equipment, sharp and electric, like the air around high voltage lines. But there were no power sources visible in the remote wilderness location. Industrial catwalks echo with every step, but they shouldn't echo back with your exact walking rhythm when you're standing still. Someone was walking the catwalks above me, matching my exact pace and gait. Bayou Parish Water Treatment operates a regional facility about 20 miles west of New Orleans, processing water for 6 rural communities along the Gulf Coast. I worked night operations there, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., Wednesday through Sunday. Solo shift, just me and the automated systems that kept clean water flowing to 30,000 people. The facility was built in the 1990s. 3-story structure with extensive catwalks connecting the various treatment levels. Metal grating walkways that allowed access to pumps, filters, and chemical feed systems throughout the complex. Good industrial design, but the metal surfaces made every footstep ring through the building. You learn to move quietly on night shift. Sound carries in those big treatment halls, and you don't want to create unnecessary noise that might mask equipment problems or safety issues. I developed a light, careful walking pattern over 3 years of working there. October 15th, I first noticed the echo. I was doing routine checks on the second level, walking the catwalk between the clarifier units. Standard inspection, visual check of equipment, note any unusual sounds or vibrations, verify that automated systems were operating normally. As I walked, I could hear my footsteps ringing off the metal grating. Normal sound, familiar rhythm. But as I stopped to check a pump motor, I heard additional footsteps continuing for a few more seconds. Not an echo, additional steps, coming from somewhere above me on the 3rd level. Same rhythm as my walking pace, same weight and timing, but continuing after I'd stopped moving. I looked up at the catwalks overhead. Empty walkways, no one visible in any direction. But I could swear I'd heard someone walking in perfect synchronization with my own movement. Probably just acoustic effects from the building's metal structure. Sound can do strange things in industrial environments, especially when you're working alone and every noise gets amplified by the silence. But it happened again during my next round. Walking the perimeter catwalk, checking the filtration units. As I moved, I could hear the familiar ring of my boots on metal grating, but there was a second set of footsteps, slightly delayed, coming from the catwalk level above me. Perfect synchronization. When I walked fast, the overhead steps matched my pace. When I slowed down to examine equipment, the echo steps slowed too. When I stopped, they'd continue for exactly 3 more steps before going silent. Like someone was following my route on the upper level, staying directly above me, but always just out of sight. I tested it. Walked to a section of catwalk where I had clear sight lines to all the upper walkways. Started moving in a deliberate pattern. 5 quick steps, pause, 3 slow steps, pause. The overhead footsteps matched exactly. 5 quick, pause, 3 slow, pause. But there was nobody visible on any of the upper catwalks. Around 2 a.m. I decided to investigate systematically. Climbed to the 3rd level, walked the entire catwalk system to verify it was empty. No one there, no equipment that could create footstep sounds, no maintenance work in progress. But when I went back down to the 2nd level and resumed my rounds, the overhead footsteps returned immediately. This time, I paid closer attention to the sound pattern. The steps weren't just matching my pace. They were using my exact gait rhythm. I walk with a slight favor of my right foot, legacy of an old ankle injury. The overhead steps showed the same asymmetrical pattern. Something was copying, not just my walking speed, but my individual movement characteristics. I called the day shift supervisor, mentioned that I was hearing unusual sounds from the catwalk system, suggested we might have a structural issue or loose grating that needed inspection. Metal walkways make noise, he said. Expansion, contraction, vibration from the pumps. You probably just never noticed it before. This is different. Sounds like footsteps, synchronized with my movements. I'll have maintenance check the catwalk mounting bolts next week. Make sure everything's secure. But I knew it wasn't loose bolts or thermal expansion. The following night, the pattern evolved. Instead of just echoing my current movements, the overhead footsteps started anticipating where I was going. I'd be walking toward a specific piece of equipment, and I'd hear footsteps moving to the corresponding position on the upper level before I got there. Like something was predicting my route and getting into position to observe my work. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps moving to a section of catwalk directly above where I was planning to do routine maintenance on a chemical feed pump. But I hadn't told anyone about the scheduled work, and it wasn't written on the shift log until I completed it. Whatever was making the sounds knew my work routine better than I documented it. I changed my pattern, deliberately avoiding the areas where the overhead footsteps seemed to be positioning themselves. But the sounds would adjust immediately, moving to new positions that corresponded to wherever I was actually going. Like something was inside my head, reading my intentions before I acted on them. Thursday night, I brought recording equipment, hoping to document the phenomenon. Set up a digital recorder on the 2nd level, positioned to capture both my footsteps and any sounds from above. When I reviewed the audio later, it was disturbing. Clear recording of my movement patterns, but the overhead footsteps were barely audible. What came through on the recording was much more subtle than what I was hearing in real time. But there was something else on the audio. Very faint, almost subliminal, but definitely present. The sound of breathing coming from the direction of the overhead catwalks. Slow, controlled breathing that synchronized with my movement patterns. When I walked faster, the breathing rate increased. When I paused to examine equipment, the breathing would slow to a resting rate. Something was up there, watching and listening, modulating its activity to match my physical state. Friday, I decided to confront whatever was causing the sounds. Instead of just listening to the overhead footsteps, I'd climb up and check each section as soon as I heard movement. The first time I heard the footsteps, I immediately climbed to the 3rd level and went to the corresponding location. Found nothing, but as soon as I went back down, the sounds resumed in a different section. I tried this several times, always with the same result. The sounds would stop whenever I investigated directly, then resume in a new location as soon as I returned to my normal work routine. But on the fourth attempt, I found something. The metal grating in one section of the third-level catwalk showed recent disturbance. Scratches in the anti-slip coating, like something heavy had been walking there repeatedly. And there were marks on the handrails that looked like finger impressions, but larger than human hands. The scratches formed a pattern that corresponded exactly to my usual inspection route on the level below. Someone or something had been pacing the upper catwalk. Following my movements from directly overhead, I documented the evidence, took photos of the scratches and handprint impressions, called the facility manager at home, reported a possible security breach. He came in immediately, reviewed my documentation, and listened to my account of the synchronized footsteps. We conducted a thorough inspection of the entire facility, checking for signs of unauthorized access. All the security systems showed normal operation. No alarm triggers, no forced entry, no indication that anyone had been in the building besides authorized personnel. But the evidence on the catwalks was undeniable. Something had been walking there, watching the night operations from above. The facility manager decided to install additional security cameras focused on the catwalk system and arranged for security patrols during night shifts until we could determine what was causing the disturbance. But I didn't wait for the investigation to conclude. Put in for a transfer to day operations, cited concerns about working alone in a facility with potential security issues. The night shift replacement lasted 2 weeks before requesting reassignment. Said the building made him uncomfortable. Too many unexplained sounds from the upper levels. Facility management eventually hired a 2-person night crew, partly for security and partly because none of the single operators would stay on the job. But according to the current night staff, the overhead footsteps continue, always matching the movement patterns of whoever's working below, always staying just out of sight on the upper catwalks. They've learned to work in pairs, with one person monitoring the upper levels while the other does equipment rounds. Some problems require teamwork to solve, and some problems are better faced with backup. The white gas stove I kept in the break room for emergency heating started acting up during my final weeks there. The flame would flare and dim in rhythm with the overhead footsteps, like something was adjusting the gas flow to match the mysterious walker's breathing pattern. Even the emergency equipment was responding to whatever presence shared the night shift with us. Shadows follow simple rules. One person, one shadow. But when you start counting more shadows than people, the rules have changed. There were always one more shadow than there should have been. I'd rented the studio apartment in the Cascade foothills for the winter, a converted barn on 5 acres about an hour east of Seattle. Perfect setup for someone who worked remotely and wanted space to think. One large room with high ceilings, enormous windows facing west toward the mountains, and enough isolation to focus without distractions. The lighting was spectacular. Late afternoon sun would stream through those big windows, creating dramatic shadow patterns across the hardwood floors. I'd positioned my desk to take advantage of the natural light and set up a reading area near the south wall, where the shadows were softest. November, I started noticing the extra shadow. When I sat at my desk in the afternoon, working on my laptop, there would be 2 shadows cast across the floor. Mine extending from the chair toward the east wall, and another shadow of similar size positioned slightly to the left. At first, I assumed it was from furniture, maybe the floor lamp or bookshelf creating a human-shaped shadow that coincidentally resembled a person. But when I checked the angles, Nothing was positioned to cast a shadow of that size and orientation. I tested it systematically, moved all the furniture away from the west windows, left just my desk and chair in the room. Same result, 2 shadows when there should have been 1. The extra shadow wasn't random. It maintained a consistent position relative to mine, always slightly offset to the left, always the same size and general shape, like someone was sitting in an invisible chair next to my desk. December brought shorter days and longer periods of optimal shadow casting light. That's when I realized the extra shadow was moving independently. I'd be typing, completely still except for my hands on the keyboard, and my shadow would show the expected static posture. But the extra shadow would shift position, lean forward, turn slightly, even appear to gesture in ways that didn't correspond to any movement I was making. I started documenting the phenomenon, set up my phone to record time-lapse videos of the shadow patterns, hoping to capture the independent movement more clearly. The recordings were disturbing. Frame by frame, they showed my shadow behaving normally while the extra shadow moved in complex patterns, turning its head, adjusting its posture, even standing up and walking around the room while I remained seated at the desk. But the most unsettling part was the timing. The extra shadow would often move just before I did, like it was anticipating my actions. I'd be about to get up for coffee, and the shadow would start rising from its chair before I'd consciously decided to move. Around Christmas, I tried something different. Instead of ignoring the extra shadow, I started interacting with it. When the shadow would turn its head, I'd wave in its direction. When it appeared to gesture, I'd gesture back, not expecting any response, just curious whether acknowledging it would change the behavior. The extra shadow started responding. If I waved, it would wave back. If I stood up, it would stand too. If I walked around the room, it would follow, maintaining the same relative position to my shadow that it had when we were both seated. But the responses weren't quite right. There was a delay, like someone learning to mimic human movements but not getting the timing perfect. And sometimes the shadow would do things I hadn't done, gestures I hadn't made, movements that seemed to come from its own agenda rather than copying mine. January, I realized the shadow was learning. The timing of its responses was getting more accurate, more natural. The movements were becoming more fluid, more human-like. Whatever was creating the extra shadow was studying my behavior and getting better at mimicking it, but it was also developing its own personality. The shadow would sometimes ignore my gestures, turning away like it was bored or distracted. It would move to different parts of the room without following my lead, exploring areas I wasn't currently using. And occasionally, it would position itself to face me directly, like it was studying me rather than copying me. February, I found evidence that the shadow interactions weren't confined to the studio. I'd been documenting the phenomenon with photos, trying to capture clear images of both shadows for analysis. But when I reviewed the pictures, they showed something I hadn't expected. In addition to my shadow and the extra shadow, there were reflections in the windows. Not reflections of me or the room's contents, but reflections of someone else. A figure standing behind me, positioned exactly where the extra shadow suggested someone should be. But there was nobody behind me when I took the photos. I started checking the windows more carefully during shadow sessions. Sure enough, there were always 2 reflections when there should have been 1. My reflection, showing normal activity, and another reflection showing someone mimicking my movements with that same slight delay I'd noticed in the shadow behavior. The reflection was clearer than the shadow, human-shaped, wearing clothes similar to mine. but with facial features that were somehow wrong. Close enough to be recognizably humanoid, but with proportions and expressions that didn't quite match normal human anatomy. March. I decided to confront whatever was creating the phenomena. Instead of just interacting with the shadow, I turned around to face the area where the reflection suggested someone was standing. Called out to whatever presence was sharing the space. "I know you're there. What do you want?" The extra shadow stopped moving. For almost a minute, it remained perfectly still while my shadow continued normal activity. Then it slowly turned to face my direction, like something had heard me and was considering how to respond. The reflection in the window showed the figure behind me turning around too, moving to face the same direction I was facing, like we were both looking at each other through some dimensional barrier. That's when I noticed a third shadow. On the wall behind me, cast by some light source I couldn't identify, was another human-shaped shadow. This one was larger, positioned higher on the wall, like someone very tall was standing in the center of the room. I was no longer dealing with one extra shadow. There were multiple presences in the studio, each casting their own shadow from impossible angles and light sources. I counted carefully. My shadow, plus 3 additional shadows that moved independently and responded to my actions with varying degrees of accuracy and delay. 4 shadows total, but only one person in the room. The sour smell of juniper sap filled the studio that evening, sharp and resinous, like someone had been crushing evergreen needles. But there were no juniper trees within miles of the converted barn. When I checked my GPS later, I found something disturbing in the track log. According to the device, I'd been walking in complex loops around the studio all afternoon, covering miles of distance without ever leaving the building. The GPS breadcrumb trail showed impossible movement patterns, routes that would have required me to walk through walls, climb to the ceiling, even move outside and around the building, while the doors remained locked. But I'd been sitting at my desk the entire time, working on my laptop and occasionally interacting with the shadows. I packed that evening, loaded my car with the essentials, and drove back to Seattle. Told the landlord I'd had a family emergency and needed to break the lease early. He was understanding, said he'd had trouble keeping tenants in that studio for more than a few months. Previous renter mentioned some unusual lighting effects, he said. Something about shadows that didn't seem right. Probably just the way those big windows interact with the mountain weather. I didn't correct him, but I kept the photos and videos, and sometimes I review them when I'm trying to understand what happened in that converted barn. The evidence is clear. Multiple shadows moving independently, reflections of figures that weren't physically present, interactions with presences that could see and respond to human behavior. The most disturbing part isn't that something was sharing the space with me. It's that they were learning to be human by watching and copying everything I did, and getting better at it every day. I caught a flash of distant lightning as I drove away from the studio that final night, though no storms were forecast for the area. In my rearview mirror, I could see lights moving inside the converted barn. Not electric lights, but something that pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat. The shadows I'd left behind were still practicing, still learning, still perfecting their imitation of human behavior. But now they had to practice without a model to copy,